They found her curled beneath a fallen wagon wheel, her body painted with ash and dried blood not entirely her own. Her calico dress was scorched at the hem, and her fingers were raw from digging shallow graves in rocky soil. The Cherokee hunter, who discovered her, almost passed her by. The faint sound of whispered prayers carried on dawn air led him to investigate a ravine most travelers avoided. Nestled between stone and shadow, she rocked back and forth, clutching a child's wooden toy. Hoarse to her chest, her eyes, once bright as summer sky, now reflected only smoke and terror. The tribal elders said she hadn't spoken a word to anyone for nearly a month, that she trembled violently whenever horses approached, that the small journal she kept tied to her waist with twine contained pages torn and stained with tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. No one could agree on exactly what happened at Copper Creek Pass, but the remains of the massacre told enough of the story: splintered wagon boards, personal belongings scattered across half a mile of trail, and shallow graves marked with crude crosses fashioned from broken wagon slats. No footprints led away except hers. Thornfield Junction wasn't on any official map, just a cluster of buildings that grew where two trails crossed, like weeds finding purchase in cracked earth. The town sat in the shadow of the western ridge, a place where most travelers simply passed through, never lingering longer than a night or two. Dust collected in doorways, and most buildings leaned slightly, as if perpetually bracing against the next storm. Nothing about Thornfield Junction invited permanence. Not the muddy thoroughfare that never quite dried, not the saloon with its splintering porch boards, and certainly not the wary glances that followed strangers. It was a frontier outpost clinging to existence, where trust was a currency few could afford. Rebecca Marshall walked these streets like a ghost, always in the dim light of dawn or dusk, when shadows were long enough to hide in. Most mornings she moved through town before the blacksmith lit his forge, before the general store unbolted its doors, before anyone had cause to look her way twice. The townsfolk called her Whisper Woman when they thought she couldn't hear. Some called her Massacre Rebecca behind closed doors. A few of the kinder souls simply referred to her as that poor Thompson girl, though she hadn't been a Thompson since she married James Marshall 3 years prior. That last name belonged to a life that felt as distant as the eastern cities she'd left behind. Rebecca never corrected them. What did names matter anymore? Her cabin stood at the far edge of town, where the southern trail began its climb toward the ridge. No one called on her there. Not the traveling preacher, not the doctor, not even the women who brought food to the sick and bereaved. Her door stayed closed. A single lantern burned low in the window each night. Those who passed by might glimpse her silhouette, standing motionless at the window, watching the road like someone expecting visitors who would never arrive. The general store kept a small crate of supplies for her near the back door. She never entered the main shop, never lingered to exchange pleasantries. She'd leave coins wrapped in a scrap of paper, take what she needed, and vanish before anyone noticed. In her absence, rumors swelled to fill the void she left behind. Her husband was killed by raiders, some said. No, it was disease that took the whole wagon train, others insisted. I heard she went mad and doesn't remember what happened at all. The truth was, Rebecca had tried to speak once after the Cherokee hunter Thomas Wolfe Path brought her to their village. But the sound of her own voice had unleashed something inside her, a torrent she couldn't control. After that, silence became her sanctuary, solid and dependable when nothing else was. The townspeople didn't know that her right hand was still cramped from clutching a knife for 3 days and nights. They didn't know that she couldn't bear the smell of wood smoke, or that she still woke screaming some nights, though no sound escaped her lips. They didn't know she kept her wedding ring wrapped in a handkerchief beneath a floorboard because she couldn't bear its weight anymore. No one asked, and Rebecca had stopped hoping anyone would. 4 years earlier, she had traveled west with bright hopes, her new husband beside her, her Bible inscribed with well wishes from family she'd never see again. James had called her his North Star, said she was constant and true, guiding him toward their future. He promised her a home with a garden in Oregon Territory, children to fill it with laughter. The gold fields didn't interest him. Rich soil for farming was treasure. Enough, but promises crumble easily under western skies. After the attack at Copper Creek Pass, after the screams and gunfire faded, after she'd lain motionless among the dead until the raiders left, she'd emerged alone. No husband to bury, no future to plan, just ashes and the cruel indifference of mountains that kept their secrets. She'd stayed in Thornfield Junction because she had nowhere else to go, because the land where everything ended became the only place that made sense. The townsfolk had made space for her existence, but never truly made her welcome. Rebecca sometimes paused outside the schoolhouse, listening to children recite their lessons through the open windows. Once, a little girl with braided hair spotted her and waved. Rebecca had managed a slight nod in return. The next day, the teacher closed the windows when she passed by. Only the wild things seemed to accept her presence without judgment. A red fox often lingered at the edge of her small garden. Hawks circled low over her cabin as if keeping watch. The silence they shared required no explanations, no painful memories examined in daylight. She earned her meager living with her hands, mending clothes, crafting simple furniture, preserving fruits and vegetables from her garden. Quiet work for a quiet existence. But her eyes, once described by James as summer sky blue, now carried the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. Some days the town seemed to forget she existed at all. Other days, a wayward glance or hushed conversation reminded her that she remained an outsider, a living reminder of wilderness dangers they all feared. She didn't defend herself from their whispers. Who survived when no one else did? What kind of woman returns alone? Rebecca had asked herself these questions too many times to count. The version of herself that had embarked westward. The woman who sang hymns around campfires, who'd written cheerful letters home, who'd planned names for children not yet conceived. That Rebecca had died at Copper Creek Pass alongside everyone else. What remained was something quieter, watchful, forever listening for sounds that haunted her dreams. Then, one morning in early autumn, she discovered footprints outside her cabin door. Not the heavy boots of townsmen, not her own familiar steps. These were different, purposeful, steady, almost entirely erased by the night's gentle rain, but unmistakably there, leading toward the woods that bordered her small property. Rebecca stood motionless, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, heart thundering against her ribs. She didn't follow the tracks. Not yet. Instead, she turned and whispered to the empty cabin behind her, the first words she'd spoken aloud in nearly a year. Someone's coming. It was a Thursday when everything changed, though in Thornfield Junction, most days bled into one another without distinction. The air felt different somehow, charged with something Rebecca couldn't name but recognized in her bones. She'd spent the morning gathering late berries from the brambles behind her cabin, her fingers stained purple-red, basket half full. When she straightened and turned toward home, she saw him standing at the crude fence that marked her property line. He wasn't from town. His buckskin jacket and the way he stood told her that much. His black hair was pulled back, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind. A rawhide cord around his neck held something she couldn't quite make out. But it was his eyes that held her, dark and steady, watching her without judgment or pity, just quiet recognition. Rebecca froze halfway between the brambles and her porch, the basket clutched to her chest like a shield. For several long moments, neither of them moved or spoke. The only sounds were autumn leaves rustling and a distant hawk's cry overhead. "Miss Marshall," he said finally, his voice low and even. "Thomas Wolfpath sent me to find you." His name was Daniel Crow Singer. He stood at her fence like a man who knew how to wait, patient as the mountains. Rebecca hadn't moved, her berry basket still clutched to her chest, juice staining her fingers like old blood. "I mean no harm," he said, keeping his distance. "I've been tracking for 2 weeks." The mention of Thomas Wolfpath's name had rooted her to the spot. The Cherokee hunter had saved her life, had carried her half-conscious from the massacre site to his village, had fed her broth when she couldn't feed herself. He had earned her trust, and now he had sent someone to find her. Daniel's eyes moved to the berry basket, then back to her face. "I have news," he added quietly. "And questions that need answers." Rebecca took one step back, then another. Whatever news he carried, she wasn't ready. 4 seasons had passed since Copper Creek, and still the memories felt raw as open wounds. She turned and fled to her cabin, shutting the door firmly behind her. Through the window, she watched him. He didn't follow, didn't call after her. He simply nodded as if he'd expected this response, then settled onto a fallen log near her fence. He pulled out a small knife and a piece of wood and began to carve, as comfortable in waiting as he seemed in everything else. Rebecca pressed her back against the door, heart racing. News, questions. The words echoed in her mind like stones dropped. In still water. What news could there be after all this time? The massacre had left no survivors except her. What questions remained that she could possibly answer? She slid down to sit on the floor, drawing her knees to her chest. The day faded to dusk as she sat there, memories washing over her in waves she couldn't control. The town of Thornfield Junction had its own rhythm, separate from Rebecca's silent world. Mayor Abernathy counted 12 buildings worthy of the name, though half of them leaned precariously after each winter storm. The Salt Creek Saloon marked the northern edge, its piano slightly out of tune, but played with enthusiasm every Saturday night. The general store stocked everything from nails to sugar to simple medicines, though anything fancier required a journey to Fort Collins, 3 days' ride to the east. The town had grown haphazardly where the eastern trail met the southern route, to Santa Fe. A watering hole for cattle and a natural spring had made it a logical stopping point, and over time, buildings sprouted like determined weeds. Most settlers moved on after a season or 2. Those who stayed were either running from something or had nowhere else to run to. Sheriff Palmer kept order with more pragmatism than law, his office doubling as the town jail with its single cell rarely occupied. The schoolhouse had 8 students, ranging from 5 to 14 years old, taught by Miss Winters, a spinster from Boston who still wore high-collared dresses despite the western heat. The blacksmith, Jeremiah Hobbs, doubled as the town's unofficial doctor, setting bones and extracting teeth with the same steady hands that shod horses and repaired wagon wheels. People in Thornfield Junction lived with constant awareness of how small they were against the vast wilderness. Homes were built close together despite the open land available. Doors were barred at night. Children were called inside before dusk. The frontier demanded caution, and those who survived learned to heed its warnings. Rebecca existed at the edges of this cautious community. Her cabin sat where the southern trail began to climb toward the ridge, far enough from town to feel separate, close enough that smoke from her chimney could still be seen. The land had been given to her out of pity after Thomas Wolfpath had brought her to Thornfield, half-starved and hollow-eyed. She remembered little of those first weeks. The doctor's wife had tended to her, washing away blood and dirt, speaking in soothing tones that barely registered. The mayor had asked questions she couldn't answer. The preacher had prayed over her, though she'd stopped believing in a merciful God somewhere between the first gunshot at Copper Creek and the last shallow grave she'd dug with bleeding hands. Eventually, the cabin had been offered. A trapper's, abandoned shelter, reinforced and made weather-tight by the townsmen. Rebecca accepted it with a nod, the only communication she could manage. In time, she made it her own. A small garden behind it, a porch that caught the morning light, a rocking chair where she sometimes sat, mending clothes for the townspeople, who left them in a basket by her gate, one of the few exchanges she could tolerate. The silence she wore wasn't a choice. Not exactly. Words had simply failed her after what she'd witnessed, or perhaps she had failed them, inadequate vessels for the horror she carried. Either way, the quiet became her companion, more reliable than any person could be. The town developed its own stories about her. Some believed she'd lost her mind along with her voice. Others whispered that she was touched by spirits, that she communed with the dead at night. A few claimed she had brought the massacre upon the wagon train through some unknown sin. Most simply felt uncomfortable in her presence, her silence a mirror reflecting their own fears of what the wilderness might take from them too. Rebecca was aware of the whispers. How could she not be? They trailed behind her on her rare ventures. Into town, hung in the air when she approached the general store. She didn't blame them. Fear needed somewhere to land, and she was an easy target, the strange, silent woman who had survived when no one should have. She kept to her routines, rising before dawn, tending her garden, preserving food, mending clothes, gathering herbs from the woods that bordered her property. Simple tasks that required no speech, that filled the hours with movement instead of memory. At night, she wrote in her journal, not words but drawings, the shapes of leaves, cloud patterns, anything that anchored her to the present moment. Rather than pulling her back to Copper Creek, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Only in sleep did her discipline falter. Dreams came vivid and merciless, gunfire, screams, the hollow eyes of the dead. She would wake gasping, sheets twisted around her limbs like restraints. On those nights, she would sit by the window until dawn, watching the road, clutching the wooden toy horse she had found in the dirt beside a child's body. 4 seasons had passed this way. Summer to fall, to winter to spring, and back to summer again. The townspeople had grown accustomed to her presence, if not comfortable with it. They left her alone, and she left them to their lives. It was an unspoken arrangement that served everyone well enough. Until today. Until Daniel Crow Singer arrived with news and questions, shattering the fragile peace she had constructed. As darkness fell, Rebecca lit a single candle and placed it in the window, her nightly ritual. She watched through the glass as Daniel looked up from his carving, his face illuminated briefly by the flame. Their eyes met across the distance. He nodded once, then returned to his work, showing no signs of leaving. She knew she should feel frightened by his presence. A stranger, connected to her past, camping at the edge of her property, yet fear wasn't what stirred in her chest as she watched him. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Curiosity. What news could be worth tracking her for 2 weeks? What questions could possibly matter after all this time? Rebecca slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled not with the usual horrors, but with Thomas Wolfpath's voice saying words she couldn't quite hear. When dawn broke, she rose and stepped onto her porch, unsurprised to find Daniel still there, a small fire burning low. Before him, his hands cradling a tin cup. He looked up as her door opened, his expression neither expectant nor demanding, simply present. Rebecca took a deep breath, then gestured toward her door, the first invitation she had extended to anyone in 4 seasons of solitude. Daniel Crow Singer stepped into Rebecca's cabin with the careful movements of a man accustomed to entering spaces where he might not be welcome. His eyes swept the small room, the neat bed in the corner, the table with its single chair, the fireplace with an iron pot hanging ready, the shelf of preserves along the back wall. Everything is orderly, minimal, practical. Nothing unnecessary, nothing frivolous. A survivor's home. Rebecca gestured to the chair, then busied herself at the hearth, stoking the embers from overnight and adding kindling. The familiar task gave her hands something to do while her mind raced. In 4 seasons, no one had crossed her threshold. Now this stranger sat at her table, his presence filling the cabin in a way that made it feel both smaller and less empty. Daniel set his knife and half-carved piece of wood on the table. The carving was taking the shape of a bird, a hawk perhaps, wings partially extended. He watched as she prepared tea, her movements efficient and precise. "Thomas Wolfpath sends his respects," he said finally, breaking the silence. He would have come himself, but his leg was injured in a hunting accident. Too difficult to make. The journey. Rebecca nodded. A bond formed in survival created obligations that outlasted words. She owed Thomas Wolfpath her life, and they both knew it. "I'm his sister's son," Daniel continued. "I was away when he found you, east at the mission school, came back last summer." He spoke simply, without embellishment, stating facts rather than making conversation. Rebecca appreciated the directness. She placed a steaming cup before him, then stood back, leaning against the wall rather than sitting. Even this small interaction felt overwhelming after so much solitude. Daniel took a sip, then looked up at her. 3 weeks ago, riders came through Cherokee territory. White men asking questions about a wagon train massacre from 4 seasons past. "Thomas sent me to warn you." Rebecca's hands tightened around her own cup. The world outside her quiet existence had suddenly reached in, unwelcome and intrusive. She'd thought Copper Creek was a closed chapter, a scar rather than an open wound. She'd been wrong. "They're heading this way," Daniel added, "following the same trail you did." Rebecca closed. Her eyes briefly, memories washing over her. The circle of wagons. The sound of horses approaching in the night. James loading his rifle, telling her to hide beneath the wagon. The first shots. The screams. She set her cup down with shaking hands and moved to a small trunk in the corner. From inside, she withdrew her journal. Pages worn from handling, binding frayed. She opened it to a blank page and picked up a pencil stub. "Who are they?" She wrote in careful script, then turned the journal toward Daniel. He studied her handwriting, then met her eyes. "They say they're from the War Department, investigating attacks on settlers. But Thomas doesn't believe them. Says they ask the wrong questions." Rebecca stared at the words on the page, then wrote again. What questions? Not who attacked the wagons, but did anyone survive? They already know what happened. They're looking for something, or someone. Rebecca's pencil hovered over the page. A dozen questions crowded her mind, but one pushed to the forefront. "Why warn me?" Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Thomas thinks you've earned your peace, says whatever happened at Copper Creek should stay buried with the dead." Rebecca's hand trembled as she wrote again. "You know what happened there?" Daniel shook his head. "Thomas never told me, said it wasn't his story to tell." She studied his face, the high cheekbones, the steady dark eyes, the set of his jaw that suggested both stubbornness and patience. There was something in his gaze that reminded her of Thomas Wolfpath. Not judgment, not pity, just quiet acceptance of hard truths. "Why did you come?" she wrote. "To warn you," he replied. Then, after a pause, "and to ask you to tell me what really happened so I can help." Rebecca closed the journal abruptly, her heart pounding. 4 seasons of silence had built walls around her memories, kept them contained where they couldn't hurt her daily. This man was asking her to tear those walls down, to speak the unspeakable. She shook her head once, sharp and definitive. Daniel didn't press. He simply nodded, finished his tea, and stood. "I'll be camping by the creek if you change your mind. Those men are 3, maybe 4 days behind me." Rebecca remained still as he moved to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "Whatever. You're protecting Rebecca Marshall. It might be time to let someone help carry the weight." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Rebecca stood motionless in the center of her cabin, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. She moved to the window, watching as Daniel made his way toward the small creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property. He walked with purpose, but without hurry, his back straight, his steps measured. She pressed her palm against the glass, a sudden, irrational fear gripping her that once he disappeared from sight, the fragile connection to someone who understood without demanding would vanish too. But he didn't go far, just to the bend where willows crowded the bank, close enough that smoke from his fire would be visible from her porch. Staying, waiting, not pushing, but not leaving either. Something shifted in Rebecca's chest, a loosening of the knot pulled tight 4 seasons ago. She didn't know if it was relief or terror. The following day brought no clarity. Rebecca went about her routines, tending her garden, preserving the last of the summer berries, mending a tear in her shawl. But her thoughts circled continuously to the men Daniel had warned her about. War Department investigators asking the wrong questions, looking for survivors, looking for her. She found herself pausing at windows, scanning the trail that led to town, jumping at shadows, startling at the cry of hawks overhead. The fear she had carefully contained now seeped through cracks in her composure, tainting everything. Midday, she spotted a rider approaching from town, Sheriff Palmer on his chestnut gelding. She watched from behind her curtain as he slowed near her fence, then dismounted and tied his horse. His visit wasn't entirely unexpected. News traveled fast in a place like Thornfield Junction, and a stranger camping near the silent widow's property would certainly qualify as news. Rebecca met him at the door before he could knock, her expression carefully neutral. "Miss Marshall," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His weathered face gave little away, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. "Thought I'd check on you. Miller's boy said there's a Cherokee camped down by your creek." Rebecca nodded once, confirming what he already knew. "Is he causing you trouble?" The sheriff's hand rested casually near his holstered pistol. Not a threat, but a reminder of his authority. Rebecca shook her head firmly. "You sure about that? Not like you have visitors?" His eyes narrowed slightly, skeptical. "Especially his kind." Rebecca's jaw tightened at the implication. She pointed toward town, then made a dismissive gesture. "Clear enough. This is my land, my business, not yours." Sheriff Palmer sighed. "Look, Miss Marshall, I respect your privacy. God knows you've earned it after whatever happened to your wagon train. But this town looks after its own. If that Indian is bothering you—" Rebecca cut him off with a sharp gesture, her expression hardening. She pointed to herself, then to the creek, then made a circular motion with her finger. "My choice. He stays." End of discussion. The sheriff studied her face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Have it your way. But I'll be keeping an eye out. Town's got enough trouble without adding more." As he turned to leave, Rebecca impulsively caught his sleeve. When he looked back, surprised, she pantomimed writing. "You need something written down?" he asked. She nodded, then pointed down the trail that led from town, raised her eyebrows in question. "You asking if there's been other strangers?" The sheriff was accustomed to interpreting her gestures after 4 seasons of wordless exchanges. Rebecca nodded again, more urgently. "Matter of fact, got word from Fort Collins yesterday. 2 government men asking questions about old Indian attacks. Headed this way." He studied her face. "That means something to you." Rebecca schooled her expression into careful blankness, but her pulse quickened. 2 men, not 3 as Daniel had said. Had one split off? Were they closer than estimated? She shook her head slightly, then stepped back, signaling the conversation was over. The sheriff watched her a moment longer, clearly unsatisfied. "Well, they'll likely pass through in a day or two. I'll let you know if they ask about you." He touched his hat again, then turned and mounted his horse. Rebecca watched until he disappeared around the bend, then sagged against the doorframe. The world was closing in, her carefully constructed sanctuary crumbling at its edges. For the first time in 4 seasons, she truly regretted her silence. Words had power, to warn, to explain, to defend. Without them, she was vulnerable in ways she couldn't afford to be. She spent the afternoon in restless activity, cleaning her already immaculate cabin, organizing preserves that needed no organizing, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into panic. As dusk approached, she found herself drawn to the window that faced the creek more and more frequently. The sight of smoke rising from Daniel's camp provided an unexpected comfort. Not alone. Not this time. As darkness fell, Rebecca made a decision. She lit her lantern, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The path to the creek was well worn from her daily trips to fetch water, easy enough to follow even in the fading light. Daniel was seated by his small fire, still working on his carving. He looked up as she approached, neither surprised nor expectant, simply present. He set aside his work and gestured to a fallen log across from him. Rebecca sat, clutching her journal to her chest like armor. For several minutes, they simply existed. In the shared space, the fire crackling between them, casting dancing shadows on the creek bank. No pressure, no demands. Just 2 people beneath the same vast sky. Finally, Rebecca opened her journal to a blank page and began to write, her pencil moving slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. When she finished, she handed the journal to Daniel, her hand trembling. "Slightly. The men from the War Department aren't investigating Indian attacks. They're covering them up. What happened at Copper Creek wasn't what everyone thinks." Daniel read the words carefully, then looked up at her. "Tell me," he said softly. Rebecca took the journal back and wrote again, filling page after page as the fire burned low and stars wheeled overhead. Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't question. He simply received her truth, one written word at a time, his expression growing more grave with each page turned. When she finally stopped writing, her hand cramped and her eyes burning with unshed tears, Daniel set the journal gently on the log beside her. "Now I understand why you don't speak," he said quietly. Rebecca looked into the embers, memory washing over her in waves. For 4 seasons, she had carried this burden alone. Now someone else knew. The false report of Indian attacks. The government. Scouts who had actually attacked the wagon train. The gold they had been transporting secretly for the War Department. The massacre that followed when the wagon master refused to surrender it. How she had survived by playing dead, covered in others' blood. How she had buried the evidence, including the strongbox, in a place no one would look. How she had walked away, the sole witness to a truth that powerful men wanted buried. "They won't stop looking," Daniel said finally. "Men like that never do." Rebecca nodded, exhaustion settling into her bones. She had known this day would come eventually. The past was never truly buried. It just waited beneath the surface, patient as stone. Daniel stared into the fire for a long moment, then looked up at her, decision clear in his eyes. "I'll help you fight them." Rebecca blinked, surprised by the offer. She had expected warning, perhaps advice to run. Not this, not partnership. "Thomas Wolfe Path taught me that some battles choose us," Daniel continued. "We don't get to walk away just because the odds are poor." He reached across the space between them, palm up, not grasping, not demanding, just offering. "You don't." Have to face this alone. Rebecca stared at his outstretched hand, heart pounding in her ears. 4 seasons of isolation had taught her to rely on no one, to expect nothing. Trust was a luxury she had forgotten how to afford. Yet something about Daniel Crowe Singer, his steady presence, his patience, the way he received her truth without judgment, made her wonder if perhaps silence wasn't the only protection available to her. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his, a connection as fragile as it was profound. Neither of them smiled, neither needed to. Some understandings ran deeper than expressions could convey. Some alliances formed in firelight were stronger than those forged in daylight or by words spoken aloud. The town of Thornfield Junction slept unaware as 2 outcasts made their pact beside a creek. The wind carried their agreement into the night, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called, a witness to the moment when Rebecca Marshall decided that perhaps survival alone wasn't enough anymore. Word traveled quickly in Thornfield Junction. By noon the following day, whispers of Rebecca Marshall's midnight meeting with the Cherokee stranger had reached the general store, the blacksmith's forge, and Mayor Abernathy's office. The town that had largely ignored her existence now watched. Her with renewed interest, their curiosity tinged with suspicion. Rebecca felt their stares as she made her way to the general store, basket in hand. For the first time in 4 seasons, she entered through the front door rather than collecting her supplies from the back. Mrs. Whitaker, the storekeeper's wife, nearly dropped the bolt of fabric she was measuring when Rebecca approached the counter. "Miss Marshall," she stammered, smoothing her apron nervously. "What a surprise." Rebecca placed a list on the counter, written in the same careful script she had used in her journal with Daniel. A request for more supplies than usual. Coffee, sugar, flour, salt, ammunition for a rifle she had never before acknowledged owning. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes widened slightly as she read. "Planning for winter early this year?" she asked, a forced lightness in her tone. Rebecca met her gaze steadily, then gave a single nod. Let the woman think about what she wanted. The truth would only endanger her. As Mrs. Whitaker gathered the items, other customers found reasons to linger. Widow Jenkins suddenly needed to examine every spool of thread in the store. Farmer Ellis developed a profound interest in tobacco prices. Young Billy Preston knocked over a display of canned goods, his eyes fixed on Rebecca the entire time. The silence that had once been her protection now felt like exposure. Every gesture scrutinized, every movement interpreted. Rebecca kept her expression neutral, her posture rigid. Only the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her discomfort. When Mrs. Whitaker finally totaled her purchases, Rebecca paid with 2 gold coins, pieces she had kept hidden beneath a floorboard for emergencies. The sight of gold raised eyebrows. Throughout the store, a widow who mended clothes for pennies shouldn't have gold eagles to spare. "Would you like these delivered to your cabin?" Mrs. Whitaker asked, clearly hoping to send her husband to investigate the sudden change in Rebecca's circumstances. Rebecca shook her head firmly, gathered her purchases into her basket, and turned to leave. As she reached the door, it swung open, revealing Sheriff Palmer. His eyes narrowed at the sight of her. "Miss Marshall," he said, touching his hat brim, "just the person I was looking for." Rebecca tensed, clutching her basket tighter. "Mind stepping over to my office for a moment? Got some questions that might interest you." It wasn't truly a request. The entire store had fallen silent, watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. Rebecca had no choice but to nod and follow him outside. The sheriff's office was a small building next to the saloon, practical and sparse. A desk, 3 chairs, a gun rack, and a single cell with iron bars at the back. Maps of the territory covered one wall, wanted posters another. Sheriff Palmer gestured to a chair as he settled behind his desk. "Those government men I mentioned," he began without preamble, "they're in Fort Collins now. Sent a telegram ahead." He withdrew yellow paper from his desk drawer, asking specifically about survivors from the Copper Creek Massacre. Rebecca's heart stuttered in her chest, but she kept her expression carefully blank. "Now, I know you don't talk about what happened out there," the sheriff continued, studying her face. "Towns respected that, but these fellas seem mighty determined to find someone who walked away from that attack." He leaned forward. "Someone who might have information about what really happened." Rebecca remained still, giving nothing away. Inside, her mind raced. The men were closer than Daniel had estimated, already in Fort Collins, perhaps only a day's ride away. "Thing is," Sheriff Palmer said, his voice lowering, "they're not just asking about survivors, they're asking about missing property, government property." His eyes fixed on her basket where the gold coins had disappeared beneath her purchases. "Valuable property?" Rebecca met his gaze, her own unflinching. 4 seasons of silence had taught her patience, had shown her how to wait out uncomfortable moments. She gave no response, offered no explanation. The sheriff sighed, leaning back. "Look, Miss Marshall, I've kept this town safe for 8 years now. Don't much care what happened before folks got here, long as they keep the peace while they're here." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "That includes your Cherokee friend down by the creek." Still, Rebecca said nothing. But when come asking questions, carrying badges and looking like they mean business, Sheriff Palmer shook his head. "That's trouble no town needs, especially not one scraping by like Thornfield." He placed both hands flat on the desk, his expression hardening slightly. "So I'm asking you straight, those men are going to bring trouble to my town?" Rebecca considered her options carefully. The sheriff wasn't her enemy, not yet. But he wasn't her ally either. His priority was Thornfield Junction, not a widow with secrets. If answering meant protecting the town at her expense, she had no doubt which choice he would make. She reached for a pencil and paper on his desk, wrote 3 words, then slid the paper toward him. "They bring trouble." Sheriff Palmer read it, then looked up at her. "To you? Or to Thornfield?" Rebecca took the paper back and added one more word. "Everywhere." The sheriff studied the paper for a long moment, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "I appreciate the warning." He stood, indicating their conversation was over. "I hope you know what you're doing, Miss Marshall, with whatever it is you're not telling me. With that Cherokee," he moved to the door and opened it, "this town's been good to you." The implied question hung in the air. Would she be good to the town in return? Rebecca gathered her basket and walked out without acknowledging it. Some questions had no simple answers. Back at her cabin, Rebecca found Daniel cutting firewood. The steady rhythm of his axe echoed through the trees, grounding in its simplicity. He paused when he saw her approach, leaning on the axe handle. "Town's talking," he said. "Not a question." Rebecca nodded, setting her basket on the porch. She retrieved her journal from inside and wrote quickly. "Sheriff knows the government men are close, in Fort Collins already. Looking for me and the gold." Daniel read her words, his expression grave. "Sooner than I thought." He glanced toward town. "Sheriff on their side." Rebecca shook her head, then shrugged, wrote again. "He protects the town. If that means giving me to them, he will. Then we need to move quickly." Daniel resumed chopping, his strokes more purposeful now. "Where did you hide it?" Rebecca hesitated. The location of the strongbox was her final secret, her last piece of leverage. Once shared, she would be truly vulnerable. Yet Daniel had proven himself trustworthy. If she couldn't trust him now, she never would. She wrote the location in her journal, then showed him, buried beneath the 3rd grave marker at Copper Creek, the one with a cross made from wagon wheel spokes. Daniel read it, then nodded. "We'll go tonight." The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Rebecca packed essentials while Daniel scouted the trail leading from town. They spoke little. She through written notes, he with concise statements that required no response. There was comfort in the shared purpose, in not facing the coming storm alone. As dusk approached, Rebecca stood on her porch, watching the town below. Lights flickered on in windows, families gathering for evening meals, the saloon starting its nightly business, normal life continuing, unaware of the danger approaching. For a moment she felt a pang of regret. This place had been her sanctuary, however imperfect. These people had given her space to heal, even if they had never truly accepted her, and now she would bring danger to their doorstep. Daniel joined her, following her gaze. Having second thoughts, Rebecca shook her head, then wrote in her journal, wondering if I should have left long ago, spared them this. Daniel considered her words. Hiding doesn't end threats, just postpones them. He nodded toward the town. They made their choice when they looked away, when they decided your silence was more comfortable than your truth. There was no judgment in his tone, just a recognition of how communities sometimes failed their most vulnerable members. Rebecca couldn't argue with his assessment. The town had accepted her presence, but never her pain, had given her shelter, but never belonging. As darkness settled fully, they prepared to depart. Rebecca donned her warmest coat, tucked her journal into a deep pocket, and slung a small pack over her shoulder. 4 seasons of life contained so little: clothes, dried food, her husband's pocket watch, the wooden toy horse she couldn't bring herself to leave behind. They were about to extinguish the lantern when hoofbeats approached from the town road, multiple riders moving quickly. Daniel peered through the window, then stepped back. 4 men, he said tersely, Sheriff Palmer, and 3 strangers. Rebecca's heart sank. The government men had arrived earlier than expected, and they'd brought the sheriff with them. Whether as guide or as enforcer remained to be seen. Daniel moved swiftly, dousing the lantern and gathering their packs. Back door, he whispered. Through the trees to the creek. We can follow it north, then circle back to the trail. Rebecca nodded, her body tensing for flight. But as they reached the back door, she paused, seized by a sudden certainty. Running now would only confirm her guilt, would bring pursuit not just tonight, but for however long it took to find her. The men outside wouldn't simply give up and leave. She touched Daniel's arm, stopping him. In the dim light filtering through the windows, she shook her head firmly. "What are you thinking?" he asked, voice low. Rebecca couldn't explain quickly enough in writing. Instead, she moved to the front room and lit a single candle. She placed it in the window, her nightly ritual, a signal visible from the road. Then she sat in her rocking chair, hands folded in her lap, and waited. Daniel stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're going to face them." She nodded once. "They'll arrest you, or worse." Another nod. She had no illusions about the mercy of men who had massacred an entire wagon train for gold. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then set down his pack. "Then we face them together." He moved to stand behind her chair, a presence both protective and deferential. This was her home, her battle. He was there to support, not to lead. The riders reached her fence. Voices carried through the night. The sheriff's familiar drawl, other voices sharper, more commanding. Boots on her porch steps, a heavy knock that shook the door in its frame. "Miss Marshall," Sheriff Palmer called. "Need to speak with you. Got some officials here from the War Department." Rebecca drew a deep breath, steadying herself. 4 seasons of silence had preserved her life. Now that same silence might end it. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Miss Marshall." The sheriff knocked again, more insistent. "I know you're in there. Lights on." She rose slowly, moved to the door, and opened it. Sheriff Palmer stood on her porch, his expression uncomfortable. Behind him were three men in dark coats, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. One stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and cold eyes that assessed her with clinical detachment. "Rebecca Marshall?" he asked, his voice cultured, precise. "I'm Colonel James Hargrove, War Department Intelligence." He withdrew a folded piece of paper from his coat. "I have questions about the incident at Copper Creek Pass, and about certain items that went missing afterward." Rebecca stared at him, her face betraying nothing, but inside recognition bloomed like ice in her veins. She knew this man, not his name, but his voice. She had heard it giving orders as her fellow travelers were executed one by one, had heard it demanding the location of the strongbox as James tried to bargain for the lives of the children. Colonel Hargrove, the architect of the massacre, standing on her porch as if he had every right to be there. His gaze shifted past her, hardening at the sight of Daniel. "And who is this?" Before Rebecca could decide how to respond, Daniel stepped forward. Daniel Crow Singer, Cherokee Nation. He stood tall, unintimidated. "I'm Miss Marshall's interpreter." Colonel Hargrove's eyebrows rose. "Interpreter?" "Miss Marshall doesn't speak," Sheriff Palmer explained. "Not since, well, not for 4 seasons now." "How convenient," one of the other men muttered. The colonel studied Rebecca with renewed interest. "Well, Miss Marshall, speaking or not, I need you to accompany us to Fort Collins. There are formal questions that need answering about what you witnessed." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Rebecca remained motionless, her gaze steady on his face. She wondered if he recognized her, the woman who had lain beneath a wagon covered in her husband's blood, watching as he ordered the deaths of 28 innocent people. Probably not. To men like him, victims were interchangeable, forgettable. "She's going, I'm going with her," Daniel said firmly. Colonel Hargrove's mouth tightened. "This is official War Department business. Civilians are not—" "She doesn't speak," Daniel interrupted. "You'll need someone to interpret her writing. Unless you read Cherokee." It was a bluff, Rebecca wrote in English, but delivered with such confidence that it gave the colonel pause. He glanced at Sheriff Palmer, who shrugged uncomfortably. "Fine," Colonel Hargrove snapped. "Both of you, then. We leave at first. Light." He fixed Rebecca with a cold stare. "I suggest you pack only what's necessary, Miss Marshall, and I'll have one of my men stationed outside your cabin tonight. For your protection, of course." The threat was thinly veiled. They weren't letting her out of their sight, not when they were so close to what they sought. Rebecca gave a single nod of acknowledgement. Inside, her mind raced. First light was hours away. Time to plan, to prepare. Colonel Hargrove clearly wanted to maintain appearances, official questions, formal procedures. That gave her a small advantage. Whatever he planned to do with her, he wouldn't do it in Thornfield Junction with witnesses present. The men departed, leaving one soldier posted at her gate. Sheriff Palmer lingered a moment, discomfort evident in his posture. "Miss Marshall," he said quietly, "I don't know what's going on here, but these men—" He glanced toward the retreating colonel. "They're not just asking questions, they're hunting something." His eyes met hers. "Or someone. You understand what I'm saying?" Rebecca understood perfectly. The sheriff was warning her, the only way he could without directly contradicting his official duties. She nodded once in acknowledgement. "Be careful," he added, then turned and followed the others. Inside the cabin, Rebecca sagged against the door, the weight of confronting her past suddenly overwhelming. Daniel moved to the window, watching the guard take up his position. "You recognize the colonel," he said. "Not a question." Rebecca nodded, then retrieved her journal and wrote rapidly. "He led the attack, ordered everyone killed. He doesn't know I saw his face." Daniel read her words, his expression grim. Then we definitely can't go with them tomorrow. Rebecca shook her head and wrote again. We won't. We leave tonight. Daniel nodded, already moving to collect their essentials. We'll need to get past the guard, he said quietly. Rebecca went to the small trunk in the corner and withdrew a bottle wrapped in cloth. Laudanum the doctor had given her years ago for the pain in her leg. She'd never used it, preferring clarity over comfort. Now she was grateful for that choice. We can drug his coffee, she wrote. I'll bring him a cup with this mixed in. Act like a nervous woman seeking protection. Daniel considered the plan, then nodded. It might work, but we need a distraction too. Something to draw his attention while you approach. Rebecca thought for a moment, then wrote again. Light a small fire in the woodshed. Nothing dangerous, just enough smoke to concern him. Good, Daniel agreed. Once he's unconscious, we take his horse. Move faster that way. The plan was simple enough, perhaps too simple, but they had little time and fewer options. The colonel and his men would be watching for any attempt to flee come morning. Now, with just one guard posted, might be their only chance. As Daniel slipped out the back door to prepare the distraction, Rebecca measured a generous dose of laudanum into a cup of coffee, then added honey to mask the bitter taste. Her hands shook slightly, but her resolve was firm. 4 seasons of silent endurance had taught her patience, but it had also honed her will to survive. She watched through the window as Daniel circled wide around the property, staying in the shadows until he reached the woodshed. The guard paced near the front gate, rifle cradled in his arms, occasionally glancing toward the cabin. Young, perhaps 25, his posture betraying exhaustion after a long ride. A thin tendril of smoke began to rise from behind the woodshed. Daniel had timed it perfectly. Enough to be noticeable, not enough to suggest immediate danger. Rebecca pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders, picked up the drugged coffee, and opened the front door. The guard turned at the sound, rifle lifting instinctively before he recognized her. Rebecca adopted a fearful expression, pointing toward the smoke now visible in the moonlight. The guard squinted, then cursed under his breath. "Stay inside, ma'am," he instructed, taking a step toward the woodshed. Rebecca shook her head frantically, then held out the coffee with trembling hands. A peace offering, a frightened woman seeking reassurance. The guard hesitated, torn between investigating the smoke and maintaining his post. Rebecca gestured again with the cup, then pointed to the fire, her expression pleading. A simple message. Please check, but first, something to warm you. Perhaps it was her apparent fear that convinced him, or simply the temptation of hot coffee on a cool night. The guard approached cautiously, rifle still ready, and accepted the cup with a brief nod of thanks. "Stay on the porch, ma'am," he said, taking a deep swallow of coffee. "I'll just check out that smoke." Rebecca nodded obediently, clasping her, hands before her like a penitent. The guard drank again, then started toward the woodshed, moving with growing sluggishness. He made it halfway across the yard before stumbling, catching himself against the well. The cup dropped from his fingers as he reached for his rifle, but it was too late. His legs folded beneath him, and he slumped to the ground. Daniel emerged from the shadows, quickly checking that the man was breathing. "He'll sleep till morning," he whispered. "Let's move." They worked efficiently, Daniel saddling the guard's horse, while Rebecca gathered their packs. Within minutes, they were ready. Rebecca paused at her door, looking back at the cabin that had been her refuge and her prison for 4 seasons. So little to show for years of existence, so little to leave behind. Daniel mounted first, then pulled Rebecca up behind him. The horse snorted softly, adjusting to the double burden. "Hold tight," Daniel murmured, and then they were moving, not toward town, but north along the creek bed, where the softer ground would muffle hoofbeats. As they passed beyond the boundary of her property, Rebecca felt a curious lightness. For 4 seasons, she had barely ventured beyond these few acres, had made her world as small as her voice. Now, the night opened around her, vast and full of possibilities. and dangers. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following the winding creek until it met the main trail. There Daniel turned east rather than west toward Copper Creek. Rebecca tapped his shoulder questioningly. "They'll expect us to go straight for the gold," he explained quietly. "We need to circle wide, approach from the direction they won't be watching." Rebecca nodded against his back. The colonel and his men weren't fools. They'd have someone already at Copper Creek waiting for her to return for the strongbox. The night deepened around them as they rode. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding beneath them. The land opened into rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper, the horses' hooves striking occasional stones that rang like distant bells. Near midnight they paused to rest the horse at a small spring. As the animal drank, Daniel surveyed their surroundings, ever vigilant. "Tell me about the strongbox," he said quietly. "What's in it that's worth killing for?" Rebecca withdrew her journal, writing, "By moonlight, gold, meant for military payrolls, and documents, records of bribes, sales of weapons to both sides, proof of corruption, at the highest levels of the War Department." Daniel read her words, understanding dawning in his eyes. No wonder they're so determined to find it. That kind of evidence could destroy careers, maybe even topple parts of the government. Rebecca nodded, then wrote again. "My husband was a clerk for the War Department before we came west. He discovered discrepancies in the accounts, started keeping records as insurance. When they found out, they sent us west with a wagon train, told us to deliver the gold to California. But it was a trap. They never intended for any of you to arrive," Daniel concluded grimly. "The wagon master knew something was wrong. Refused to follow their planned route. That's when they attacked, claimed it was Indians. Easier to blame Cherokee or Comanche than admit the truth." Daniel's jaw tightened. "My people have been blamed for many crimes we didn't commit." Rebecca touched his arm gently, understanding in her eyes. Both of them had suffered from the same corrupt power. His people through systematic lies, her through targeted violence. Their fates were more connected than she had initially realized. They continued riding through the night, taking a winding route that kept them away from established trails. Dawn found them in a stand of cottonwoods several miles from Copper Creek. Daniel scouted ahead on foot while Rebecca waited with the horse, her body aching from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Two riders at the creek, watching the graves." Rebecca wasn't surprised. Colonel Hargrove had played this game too long to leave such an obvious location unguarded. She pulled out her journal. "We need to create another distraction, draw them away long enough to retrieve the strongbox." Daniel considered this. "If they see either of us, they'll know the sheriff failed to hold us. The alarm will spread quickly." Rebecca thought for a moment, then wrote again. "What if they think we're still hiding in Thornfield? We could send the horse back toward town, make them think we're fleeing in that direction." "It might work," Daniel agreed. "But we'd be on foot afterward, carrying a heavy strongbox. We wouldn't get far before they caught up." Rebecca stared at the rising sun, weighing their options. Running wasn't a sustainable strategy, not against men with resources and authority. Eventually, they would be caught, unless they could change the terms of engagement. She wrote again, determination in every stroke of her pencil. "We don't run with the gold. We use it. The documents are the real power." Daniel read her words, intrigued. "What are you suggesting? We need to get word to someone who can use this evidence, someone with enough influence to protect us and expose the truth. Do you know someone like that?" Rebecca nodded slowly, then wrote a name that made Daniel's eyebrows rise in surprise. "Senator Montgomery Gardner, my father's oldest friend. In Denver now, according to newspaper accounts." "Denver's a 5-day ride from here," Daniel pointed out. "We don't need to reach Denver, just get word to him about what we have and where to find us." Daniel considered the plan. The telegraph office in Fort Collins. Rebecca shook her head firmly. Too risky. The colonel will be watching. Then what? Rebecca's eyes gleamed with newfound purpose as she wrote. There's a newspaper in Silverdale, 2 days' ride south. The editor fought for the Union, speaks out against corruption. If we can get the story to him, get him to print even part of it, and wire it to other papers. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding. Create a situation too public for the colonel to control. Exactly. Once the story is out, the gold and documents become our protection, not our burden. It was a dangerous gamble. If they failed, there would be no second chance. But Rebecca was tired of hiding, tired of silence, tired of letting fear dictate her choices. For 4 seasons, she had survived. Now it was time to live. As the sun climbed higher, they refined their plan. The horse, laden with Rebecca's shawl and a few personal items, would be sent back toward Thornfield Junction, creating a false trail. Meanwhile, they would circle to Copper Creek on foot, approach from the ridge above rather than along the trail, and wait for the right moment to retrieve the strongbox. Then, traveling only at night and avoiding all roads, they would make their way south to Silverdale and the newspaper office. A desperate plan, but desperation had kept Rebecca alive once before. Perhaps it would again. As they prepared to set the plan in motion, Daniel placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "You know what this means," he said quietly. "Once we do this, there's no going back to silence, no going back to your cabin. Your life there is over." Rebecca met his gaze steadily, then wrote one final line in her journal before tucking it away. That life ended 4 seasons ago at Copper Creek. I've been a ghost long enough. With the rising sun warming her face, Rebecca Marshall stepped back into the world of the living, a world of risk and pain, yes, but also one of purpose, of truth, of voice. The time for silence had passed. The approach to Copper Creek Pass was more difficult than Rebecca remembered. 4 seasons had changed the landscape. Spring floods had carved new channels in the creek bed, winter winds had toppled trees across the old wagon trail, and nature had begun the slow process of reclaiming the site of so much human suffering. They moved carefully, staying high on the ridge where trees provided cover. Daniel led the way, his steps silent on the pine-needled ground, pausing often to survey their surroundings. Rebecca followed close behind, her limp more pronounced after hours of walking, but her determination unwavering. By midday, they reached a vantage point overlooking the small valley where the massacre had occurred. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat at the sight. The burned wagons were gone, either salvaged by passing travelers or washed away in floods. But the grave markers remained, crude crosses fashioned from wagon parts, standing in silent testimony to lives cut short. 2 men on horseback circled the site, moving with the practiced vigilance of soldiers. Occasionally one would dismount to examine a marker more closely, then return to his horse with evident frustration. Daniel touched Rebecca's arm, drawing her back from the edge. "The 3rd grave," he whispered. "Which one is it?" Rebecca withdrew her journal and sketched a quick map of the site, marking the location of the grave that held the strongbox. It stood slightly apart from the others, near a lightning-struck pine that had somehow survived 4 seasons of storms. "We'll need to wait until nightfall," Daniel murmured. "Less chance of being seen." Rebecca nodded, though the thought of spending hours so close to the place that haunted her dreams sent cold shivers down her spine. This land held her worst memories, the sounds of gunfire and screams, the copper smell of blood, the weight of bodies she'd dragged to shallow graves. Coming back was like reopening a wound she'd spent 4 seasons trying to close. Daniel seemed to sense her discomfort. "We don't have to stay right here," he said. "There's a sheltered spot further along the ridge. We can rest, prepare." They retreated to a small depression where a fallen tree created a natural windbreak. Rebecca sank down gratefully, her leg throbbing from the unaccustomed exertion. Daniel produced dried meat and a small canteen of water from his pack. They ate in silence, the gravity of their situation making conversation, even one-sided, seem unnecessary. As she chewed the tough jerky, Rebecca found her mind drifting to the night of the attack. It had begun so ordinarily. The wagons circled for the evening, cookfires burning, children being settled for the night. James had been writing in his journal, documenting the day's journey as he did every evening. The wagon master had just set the watch rotation when riders approached from the east. They'd claimed to be army scouts, sent to escort the train through dangerous territory. The wagon master had been suspicious. They weren't expected, hadn't been mentioned at the last fort. But they carried proper identification, spoke with authority. While the leaders conferred, the scouts had positioned themselves throughout. The camp, the attack came without warning. One moment, discussion, the next, gunfire. Rebecca closed her eyes against the memory, but it came anyway. James pushing her beneath their wagon, covering her with his body as bullets tore through canvas. And Wood, his blood soaking her dress, as he whispered for her to stay silent, to play dead if they came. The methodical way the soldiers moved from wagon to wagon, ensuring no survivors. The leader, Colonel Hargrove, though she hadn't known his name then, demanding to know where the strongbox was hidden. The wagon master's defiance, the execution, that followed. She had lain there for hours after the killing stopped, James's body growing cold above her, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When the soldiers finally left with the wagons they hadn't burned, she had crawled out into a night silent, except for the crackling of flames. Alone among the dead, she had done the only thing possible, buried those she could, marked their graves, and hidden the strongbox the soldiers had failed to find. Then she had walked east, following the creek, until Thomas Wolfpath found her half-conscious and delirious with grief. A touch on her arm brought Rebecca back to the present. Daniel was watching her with concern in his dark eyes. She realized. Tears were streaming down her face, the first she had shed in seasons. "We don't have to do this," he said quietly. "We could keep going. Head south now." Rebecca shook her head firmly, wiping away the tears with the back of her hand. She took out her journal and wrote with fierce determination, "The dead deserve justice. I owe them that much." Daniel nodded, understanding in his face. "Then we'll get it for them." He glanced at the sun, beginning its descent toward the western mountains. "A few more hours until dark. You should rest if you can." Rebecca doubted sleep would come in this place of ghosts, but she leaned back against the fallen tree, closing her eyes. To her surprise, exhaustion soon pulled her under into a deep, dreamless rest. She woke to Daniel's hand on her shoulder and the purple light of dusk filling the sky. "Time," he said simply. They made their final preparations in silence, checking their single pistol, securing their meager supplies, planning their approach. The night would provide cover, but also challenges. Digging would make noise. If the guards were alert, discovery was almost certain. As full darkness settled over the pass, they began their descent from the ridge, moving slowly, testing each step for loose stones or dry branches that might betray their presence. The quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate by without revealing them to watching eyes. They paused at the edge of the clearing, observing the guards. One had made camp near the creek, a small fire burning as he prepared a meal. The other patrolled the perimeter of the gravesite, rifle ready, moving in a predictable pattern. Daniel leaned close to Rebecca's ear. "I'll create a distraction. Lead the patrol away. You go for the strongbox." Rebecca nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she feared the guards might hear it. She clutched the small folding shovel they'd brought, its metal cool against her palm. Daniel squeezed her shoulder. once then melted into the darkness, circling wide around the site. Rebecca waited, counting her breaths, watching the patrolling guard. 1 circuit, 2, 3. Then came the sound, a series of stone falls from the far side of the creek, as if someone was moving carelessly in the darkness. The guard by the fire stood quickly, rifle raised. The patrolling guard turned toward the sound. "Check it out," the first guard called. "I'll watch the graves." The patrol guard moved cautiously toward the creek, disappearing into the shadows beyond the firelight. More sounds followed, branches breaking, stones clattering down the slope. The first guard stood tense, eyes straining to see what was happening. This was her chance. Rebecca moved from cover, staying low, using the grave markers themselves as concealment as she made her way toward the third cross. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hurry, but she forced herself to move, methodically, placing each foot with care. The lightning-struck pine loomed ahead, its split trunk pale in the moonlight. Beside it stood the cross she sought, fashioned from wagon wheel spokes bound with rawhide. Rebecca knelt before it, the position both practical and reverential. These might not be real graves in the traditional sense, but they were sacred. Nonetheless, she began to dig, the folding shovel cutting through earth softened by recent rains. The sound seemed deafening to her ears, but the continuing commotion across the creek, Daniel leading the guard on a frustrating chase, covered her movements. 6 inches down, the shovel struck something solid. Rebecca dug around the edges, fingers joining the work, scraping away dirt until she could feel the outline of the strongbox. Small but heavy, roughly the size of a Bible. She worked it free from the earth, her hands trembling with effort and emotion, for something that had cost so many lives it seemed unremarkable, a simple iron box with a heavy lock. Yet within it lay the proof of corruption and murder that could bring down powerful men, that could give the dead of Copper Creek the justice they deserved. Rebecca tucked the box into her pack, then quickly refilled the hole, smoothing the surface. As best she could in the dim light, she replaced the cross, ensuring it stood as before, then began her careful retreat, staying low among the markers. 20 feet from the tree line, disaster struck. Her bad leg, strained from hours of walking and kneeling, buckled beneath her. She fell forward, catching herself with her hands, but not before her pack hit the ground with a dull thud. The guard by the fire turned sharply. "Who's there?" Rebecca froze, heart hammering in her chest. The guard raised his rifle, peering into the darkness. "Thompson, that you?" When no answer came, he reached for a burning branch from the fire, lifting it high to cast light into the shadows. "I said, who's there? Answer or I shoot." Rebecca knew she couldn't move fast enough to reach the trees before being seen. Instead, she pressed herself flat against the ground, hoping the grave markers and tall grass would conceal her. The guard advanced slowly, torch held high, rifle ready. 10 feet away, 8, 6, a shout from across the creek saved her. "Ellis, I need help! Someone's out here!" The guard, Ellis, hesitated, torn between investigating the sound he'd heard and responding to his companion's call. Another shout. More urgent, decided him. He turned and hurried toward the creek, taking the torch with him. Rebecca didn't waste the opportunity. Ignoring the pain in her leg, she crawled to the tree line, then pulled herself up using a low branch. The strongbox weighed heavy in her pack, pulling at her shoulders as she limped into the protective darkness of the forest. She didn't stop until she reached their agreed meeting point. A lightning-blasted oak tree, a quarter-mile from the grave site. There she collapsed against the trunk, chest heaving, leg throbbing, but the strongbox secure. Long minutes passed. Shouts echoed from the direction of the creek, then silence. Rebecca strained to hear any sound of pursuit, any indication of Daniel's fate. Nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a night bird. What if he'd been captured? Or worse, The possibility sat like a stone in her stomach. After 4 seasons of isolation, the thought of losing her only ally, the only person who knew her truth, was unexpectedly painful. Then came the softest of sounds. A deliberate snap of a twig, a signal rather than an accident. Relief flooded through her as Daniel materialized from the shadows, moving with the silent grace that had become familiar. "You got it," he whispered. Rebecca nodded, patting her pack. "Good. They're searching the eastern slope now. We need to move. North, stay ahead of them." Rebecca struggled to her feet, wincing as weight settled on her injured leg. Daniel noticed immediately. "You're hurt." She shook her head dismissively, but when she took a step, her leg nearly gave way again. Daniel caught her arm, steadying her. "Let me see." Rebecca reluctantly allowed him to examine her leg. In the faint moonlight filtering through the branches, Daniel's fingers probed gently around her knee, finding the swelling there. "Strained, not broken," he concluded. "But you can't walk far on it." He glanced back toward the gravesite, where torches now moved among the markers. "And we can't stay here." He thought for a moment, then made a decision. "There's a place 2 miles north, an old trapper's cabin Thomas showed me. We can shelter there until morning, then reassess." It was their only viable option. Rebecca nodded. Agreement, then reached into her pack and withdrew the strongbox, offering it to Daniel. If they were separated, he would have a better chance of escaping with it. Daniel understood the gesture but shook his head. "It stays with you. I'll scout. Ahead, find the safest path." He positioned himself beside her, offering his shoulder for support. "Lean on me. We'll go slow." Their progress through the dark forest was painfully slow. Every step sent jolts of pain through Rebecca's leg, and the uneven ground made balance difficult. Daniel bore her weight without complaint, adjusting their pace to accommodate her injury, pausing often to listen for pursuit. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness both concealing friend and foe alike. Twice they froze at sounds of searchers in the distance, pressing against tree trunks until the danger passed. The strongbox grew heavier with each step, a physical manifestation of the burden Rebecca had carried alone for 4 seasons. Near midnight, they reached the cabin Daniel had mentioned. Little more than a 1-room shelter with a collapsed corner, it nonetheless offered protection from prying eyes. Daniel helped Rebecca inside, settling her on a rough-hewn bench before checking the perimeter. "No one's been here in seasons," he reported upon returning. "We should be safe until morning." Rebecca withdrew her journal, writing by the faint light of the stars through the broken roof. "Thank you for helping me. You didn't have to." Daniel read her words, then met her gaze. "Yes, I did." He settled beside her on the bench. "Thomas Wolfe. Path taught me that what happens to one people happens to all eventually. Your enemies are my enemies." Rebecca studied his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the steadiness in his dark eyes. There was something comforting in his certainty, his willingness to stand against injustice, regardless of whose injustice it was. She wrote again. "We should open it. See what we're risking our lives for." Daniel nodded. "Can it be opened without—" "The key!" Rebecca managed a small, grim smile. She reached beneath her collar and withdrew a cord that had hung there, hidden for 4 seasons. On it dangled a small iron key. "James gave it to me when we first joined the wagon train. Said if anything happened to him, I should take the box to Senator Gardner." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've had the key all this time?" Rebecca nodded, then slipped the cord over her head and inserted the key into the strongbox's lock. It turned with surprising ease for something buried 4 seasons. The lid creaked open, revealing contents packed tightly within. On top lay a leather portfolio filled with documents, letters bearing War Department seals, ledgers with columns of numbers and names, maps with routes marked in red ink. Beneath these was a canvas bag, heavy with the unmistakable weight of gold coins. Daniel examined some of the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. Names, dates, amounts, he murmured. Weapons sold to both Union and Confederate. Horses during the war. Supplies diverted, funds embezzled. He looked up at Rebecca. This is enough to hang men. Rebecca nodded grimly. She had never read the documents herself. James had kept their contents private, even from her, but she had understood their importance from his increasingly agitated state as they traveled west. She pointed to a particular letter bearing an ornate signature, then wrote in her journal, "That's Secretary Wilson's signature, authorizing payment to war profiteers." Daniel let out a low whistle. No wonder they're willing to kill for this. It implicates people at the highest levels. They carefully repacked the box, securing its contents. The existence of these documents changed everything. This wasn't just about Rebecca's survival anymore, or even justice for the wagon train victims. This was about corruption that had cost countless lives during the war and continued to poison the country's healing. "We need to get this to someone who can use it," Rebecca wrote. "Someone who can't be bought or threatened." "Your Senator Gardner?" Rebecca considered this, then wrote more. "And the newspaper editor in Silverdale. The more people who know, the safer the information, and us, will be." Daniel nodded. "Smart." He glanced at her swollen knee. "But we have a more immediate problem. You can't travel far on that leg, and those men will widen their search. Come morning." Rebecca frowned, thinking. 2 miles back to Copper Creek, where the colonel's men searched. Perhaps 10 miles to the nearest settlement, which would offer little protection. Thornfield Junction was at least a day's ride, even with healthy horses, and Silverdale lay even further south. She wrote again, "We need a horse, or a wagon." Agreed. But where? Daniel peered through a gap in the wall toward the dark forest. "We're miles from anywhere." Rebecca closed her eyes, mentally mapping the area. The wagon train had camped at several locations before reaching Copper Creek Pass. One of them, her eyes snapped open. She wrote quickly, "The Hudson Homestead, 5 miles northwest. Family of settlers who helped our wagon train when we passed through. Good people. You think they're still there? After 4 seasons?" Rebecca shrugged. It was a gamble, but one worth taking. The Hudsons had been establishing a permanent homestead, not just passing through. They'd had fields planted, livestock, a sturdy cabin built to last. Best chance we have. Daniel considered this, then nodded. "We'll rest until first light, then head northwest. I can fashion a walking stick for you, make travel easier." As he spoke, exhaustion washed over Rebecca. The day's events, retrieving the strongbox, confronting her past, re-injuring her leg, had drained her completely. Even the hard bench beneath her felt inviting. Daniel noticed her fatigue. "Sleep," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." Rebecca wanted to protest, to insist on sharing the burden, but her body betrayed her. Within moments of closing her eyes, she slipped into a deep sleep filled with fragments of memory, James's face, the wagon train, the sound of gunfire. But this time, the nightmares didn't consume her. This time, there was something else, a sense of purpose, of forward motion. She woke to grey dawn light filtering through the cabin's broken walls and the smell of pine smoke. Daniel had built a small, nearly smokeless fire in what remained. Of the hearth, he was heating water in a battered tin cup, willow bark tea, he explained, seeing her questioning look. "For the pain in your leg," Rebecca smiled gratefully, touched by the thoughtfulness. As she sipped the bitter brew, Daniel showed her the walking stick he'd fashioned, a sturdy pine branch stripped of bark, one end wrapped with cloth to form. "A comfortable grip. It's 5 miles to this Hudson place," he said. "Rough country. We'll need to pace ourselves." Rebecca nodded. She understood the risks. Moving slowly while being hunted was far from ideal. But without help, they wouldn't make it to Silverdale, wouldn't get the evidence to those who could use it. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, Rebecca leaning heavily on the walking stick, the strongbox secure in Daniel's pack. The morning was crisp, dew clinging to pine needles and sparse grass. Birds called from the canopy overhead, oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath them. Their progress was painfully slow. What might have been a 2-hour journey for healthy travelers stretched toward midday, as Rebecca navigated uneven ground, fallen logs, and rocky stream crossings. Her knee throbbed with each step, but the willow bark tea had taken the edge off. The pain. Daniel matched his pace to hers, without comment, occasionally offering his arm for particularly difficult stretches. As the sun reached its zenith, they paused in a small clearing. Rebecca sank onto a fallen log, massaging her swollen knee. Daniel stood watch, his posture alerting her even before he spoke. "Riders," he said quietly, "coming from the south." Rebecca tensed, fear washing through her. Had they been tracked? Were the colonel's men closing in? Daniel shook his head as if reading her thoughts. Different direction, not from Copper Creek. That was small comfort. The colonel could have split his forces, sent men to search multiple areas. Rebecca struggled to her feet, reaching for the walking stick. Daniel held up a hand, listening intently. 2 horses, moving slowly, not searching, traveling. He motioned for Rebecca to stay put, then moved silently to the edge of the clearing, blending into the shadows of a large pine. Minutes passed, tension building with each moment of silence. Then came the sound of hooves on the trail below them, accompanied by the creak of leather and the occasional snort of horses. Voices drifted up, a man and a woman conversing casually. Settlers, perhaps, or travelers, not soldiers on the hunt. Daniel returned to Rebecca's side. Local folks from the sound of it, heading north. He glanced at her leg, then back toward the trail. This could be our chance for faster transportation. Rebecca hesitated. Approaching strangers carried its own risks. What if they recognized her from wanted posters? What if they were sympathetic to the government men searching for her, yet continuing on foot, with her injury slowing them further with each mile, was an even greater risk. She nodded her agreement. Daniel helped her to her feet. "Let me do the talking. Follow my lead." They made their way carefully down to the trail, timing their arrival to intercept the travelers. As the sound of hooves grew closer, Daniel positioned them in plain sight. 2 weary travelers, one injured, nothing threatening or suspicious about them. Around the bend came an older couple in a small wagon drawn by a single horse. A second horse laden with supplies followed behind on a lead rope. The man, white-bearded and weather-beaten, pulled up sharply at the sight of them. "Ho there," he called, one hand dropping to what Rebecca suspected was a pistol hidden beneath the seat. Daniel raised his hands slightly, showing they were empty. "Good day," he called back. "Pardon the interruption. My friend is injured and we're trying to reach the Hudson homestead. Might you know if they're still settled northwest of here?" The woman leaned forward, studying them with sharp eyes. "Hudson's. Sure, they're still there. About 3 miles that way." She pointed down the trail. "But the missus is alone with the children now. Mr. Hudson passed away last winter. Fever took him." Rebecca felt a pang of sadness. John Hudson had been a kind man, generous with advice and supplies for the wagon train. "We're sorry to hear that," Daniel said sincerely. "My friend knew them when she came through with a wagon train some years back. We were hoping they might help us with transportation. My friend's leg is badly hurt." The couple exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years together. The man's hand moved away from his hidden weapon. "Where are you folks headed ultimately?" he asked. Daniel hesitated only briefly. "Silverdale? My friend has family there." Another glance between the couple. Then the woman spoke. "Silverdale, a good 4 days' ride south. That's a long way on an injured leg." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel agreed. "That's why we're hoping to find help." The man scratched his beard thoughtfully. "We're headed up to our son's place, north of the Hudsons, but—" He looked at his wife again, received a small nod. "We could spare our packhorse, not the fastest animal, but steady. Get you to Silverdale eventually." Rebecca's heart leapt at the unexpected kindness. Daniel kept his expression measured. "That's very generous. We can pay—" The man waved dismissively. "Keep your money. These are hard lands. Folks need to help each other when they can." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Though I get the feeling you two are in some kind of trouble." Daniel didn't deny it. "Yes, sir, but not the kind good people need worry about." The woman studied Rebecca's face, then nodded decisively. "I believe that." She reached into the wagon and pulled out a small bundle. "Some biscuits and jerky. Not much, but it'll help on the journey." As Daniel helped untie the packhorse from the wagon, the man leaned down toward Rebecca. "Word of advice," he said quietly. "Whatever's chasing you, it came through Thornfield Junction yesterday. Whole bunch of official-looking men asking questions. Made quite a stir." He glanced at Daniel, then back to her. "They seemed particularly interested in a Cherokee man traveling with a woman." Rebecca's blood ran cold. The colonel and his men had discovered their absence sooner than expected, and had already spread the word. The net was tightening. She took out her journal and wrote quickly, "Thank you for the warning, and the horse." The man read her note, then tipped his hat. "Can't stand busybodies in official uniforms myself. Never brought anything but trouble in my experience." He straightened, raising his voice for Daniel to hear. "Horse answers to the name of Jasper. Bit stubborn on hills, but won't spook at gunfire." A useful quality, given their circumstances. Daniel finished securing their meager belongings to the horse, then helped Rebecca mount. The height of the animal sent fresh pain through her injured knee, but being off her feet was an immeasurable relief. "Safe travels," the woman called, as Daniel took the reins and led the horse back into the trees, avoiding the main trail. "God, I'll go with you," the man added more quietly. Rebecca watched them continue north, these strangers who had shown such unexpected kindness. In her 4 seasons of isolation, she had forgotten that goodness still existed in the world. Uncomplicated, unquestioning help offered simply because it was needed. Perhaps, she thought as Daniel led the horse through the forest, there were more allies in the world than she had dared to hope. They traveled in silence for a time, following game trails when possible, creating their own path when necessary. The horse, Jasper, proved as reliable as promised, navigating the difficult terrain with steady determination. Rebecca's mind turned over the kind couple's warning. If the colonel's men were already spreading word about a Cherokee man traveling with a mute woman, their path to Silverdale had just become considerably more dangerous. She tapped Daniel's shoulder and gestured for her journal. When he handed it to her, she balanced it against the horse's neck and wrote, "We need to avoid settlements. Too dangerous now." Daniel read her words and nodded. "I've been thinking the same. We'll have to take a longer route, stay in the foothills rather than follow the valley." "What about provisions? Game is plentiful in these hills. Water too." "We'll manage." Rebecca wasn't entirely convinced. Even with a horse, the journey to Silverdale would take days. Days where Colonel Hargrove's men would be scouring every trail, questioning every traveler, perhaps posting rewards for information. And while Daniel's woodcraft was impressive, surviving in the wilderness with an injured companion and a valuable strongbox would test his skills to their limit. "If we're caught, destroy the documents before they take you," she wrote. "Better lost than back in their hands." Daniel's expression hardened. "We won't be caught." Rebecca recognized the determination in his voice, but she was too practical to share his optimism. 4 seasons of surviving had taught her that hope was a luxury, preparation a necessity. She wrote again, "Promise me, if there's no other choice, burn everything." Daniel met her gaze, then nodded once, solemn. "I promise." As the afternoon wore on, they climbed higher into the foothills, seeking routes that offered concealment while remaining passable for the horse. Rebecca's leg throbbed with each step Jasper took, but she endured without complaint. Physical pain was an old companion, far less troubling than the fear that dogged their path. Near sunset, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley they had traversed. In the distance, the spiral of smoke from a campfire rose against the darkening sky, too large for travelers, too organized for settlers. "Military camp," Daniel confirmed, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "Your colonel moves quickly." Rebecca frowned. The search was expanding faster than she had anticipated. They needed to increase their pace, to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers, but her injury made that difficult, and pushing the horse too hard would only leave them stranded. As darkness fell, Daniel found a sheltered hollow where a jumble of fallen rocks created a natural windbreak. He helped Rebecca dismount, the motion sending fresh pain through her knee, then tended to Jasper while she settled against a smooth boulder. "No fire tonight," he said, watching as Rebecca massaged her swollen joint. "Too visible from below." She nodded agreement, though the night promised to be cold. Better to endure discomfort than risk discovery. Daniel disappeared briefly into the gathering darkness, returning with a handful of roots and leaves. He crushed these between flat stones, then mixed the resulting paste with water from their canteen. "Cherokee. Medicine," he explained, kneeling beside her, "for swelling and pain." Rebecca hesitated only momentarily before extending her leg, allowing him to apply the poultice to her knee. His touch was gentle, his movements efficient and practiced. The paste felt cool against her heated skin, the scent sharp and medicinal. "My grandmother was a healer," Daniel said as he worked, "taught me which plants heal, which harm, which speak to the spirits." A faint smile crossed his face. "I was a poor student, more interested in hunting than healing, but some lessons stay. With you." Rebecca watched him bind the poultice with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. There was something comforting in his quiet competence, his matter-of-fact approach to their situation. 4 seasons of solitude had left her unaccustomed to rely on anyone, yet here she was, placing her life in the hands of a man she had known for mere days. Strange how the crisis forged connections that might otherwise take years to build. When he finished, Daniel settled beside her, offering jerky from their meager supplies. They ate in companionable silence, watching as stars appeared in the velvet sky above. The air grew colder, their breath visible in small clouds. Rebecca retrieved her journal, writing by the faint light of the quarter moon. "Tell me about your people, your home." Daniel read her words, expression softening. "My village lies 3 days' ride west of Thornfield Junction, hidden in a valley most white settlers haven't discovered yet." Pride tinged his voice. "We maintain the old ways, but adapt. When necessary, hunt with rifles and arrows both. Grow corn and trade for flour. My Uncle Thomas is respected for his wisdom, for bridging the gap between our world and yours. You went to a mission school." A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "For 3 years, they tried to erase Cherokee from my tongue, replace it with English and Latin, cut my hair, dressed me like a white man's son." His jaw tightened. "Thought they were saving my soul by killing my spirit." Rebecca could see the old pain in his eyes, understood it in a way few others might. She, too, had been shaped by forces beyond her control, had lost pieces of herself to others' actions. She wrote again, "Yet you return to your people." "Not all do," Daniel acknowledged. "Some stay in the white man's world, find it easier, safer." He looked up at the stars. "I couldn't. The mission walls felt like a prison. The prayers are like chains." He gestured to the vast wilderness around them. "This is my church. These mountains are my scripture." Rebecca nodded, understanding completely. Though raised in the Christian tradition, she had found more solace in the silent testimony of nature than in preachers' words since the massacre. The steadfast mountains, the relentless rivers, the resilient trees, they spoke more truly of endurance and rebirth than any sermon. "Do your people know what you're doing? Helping me?" Daniel shook his head. "Only Thomas. He sent me to warn you, but chose to stay, to help recover the strongbox. That was mine alone." He studied her face in the moonlight. "My people have suffered much at the hands of corrupt officials, broken treaties, false promises. If exposing these men's crimes helps prevent more suffering, then my choice serves my people too." Rebecca had never considered that perspective, that her personal quest for justice might benefit others beyond the victims of Copper Creek. The thought was both heartening and sobering. It raised the stakes, made failure even more unthinkable. "What if we don't succeed?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "Then we die having tried to right a wrong. There are worse fates." He reached over and gently closed her journal. "You should rest. Tomorrow will test us further." Rebecca wanted to protest, to ask more questions, to explore this unexpected connection between their separate struggles. But exhaustion pulled at her limbs, the Cherokee medicine working its way through her system, dulling pain and bringing drowsiness in its wake. She awoke to grey dawn light and the sound of soft rain. Daniel was already up, securing their belongings against the weather. The strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth, sat beside him, a constant reminder of their purpose. "How's the knee?" he asked, noticing she was awake. Rebecca tentatively flexed her leg. The swelling had decreased notably, though pain still flared with movement. She gave a small nod. "Better, if not healed." "Good. The rain will help us. Harder to track, harder to spot from a distance." Daniel glanced at the valley below, now shrouded in mist. "But it will slow us too. Trails get slick, streams rise quickly." They ate a cold breakfast of the remaining biscuits, then prepared to depart. Rebecca winced as Daniel helped her onto Jasper, her knee protesting the motion, despite its improvement. The horse snorted unhappily at the continuing rain, but stood steady. The day that followed tested them severely. The rain persisted, sometimes lessening to a fine mist, other times strengthening to a driving downpour. The trails grew treacherous, mud sucking at Jasper's hooves, rocks slippery with moisture. Twice the horse nearly lost his footing on steep descents, forcing Daniel to lead him along more gradual but time-consuming routes. By midday they were all soaked through, cold penetrating to the bone. Rebecca's hands had grown so numb she could barely grip the saddle horn. Daniel's pace had slowed, each step carefully placed in the treacherous terrain. Neither complained. The weather that tormented them also protected them, making pursuit nearly impossible. As afternoon faded toward evening, the rain finally stopped. Steam rose from the forest floor as weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Daniel paused their journey, surveying their surroundings with growing concern. "We need shelter," he said, eyeing Rebecca's shivering form. "And fire. This cold will kill us faster than any bullet." Rebecca couldn't argue. Her clothes clung to her body, her hair plastered to her skull. Even the strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth and secured to Jasper's saddle, had suffered from the relentless moisture. Daniel led them eastward, following a ridge that offered views of the valley while keeping them concealed within the tree line. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, he spotted what they needed: a rock overhang creating a natural shelter, dry ground beneath it, fallen timber nearby for fuel. They made camp with methodical efficiency born of necessity. Daniel built a small, nearly smokeless fire while Rebecca tended to Jasper, removing his saddle and rubbing him down with handfuls of dry grass found beneath the overhang. The horse nickered gratefully, nuzzling her shoulder in a rare display of affection. The fire's warmth was almost painful against Rebecca's chilled skin. She held her hands toward the flames, feeling sensation gradually return in prickling waves. Daniel arranged their wet clothes on rocks near the fire to dry, then settled beside her, shoulders touching for shared warmth. "We made good progress despite the rain," he said, his voice low. "Should reach the foothills beyond Miller's Ridge by tomorrow afternoon. From there, it's another day to Silverdale if we push hard." Rebecca nodded, trying to ignore the way her teeth chattered. Another day of hard riding on her injured leg would be excruciating but necessary. The longer they remained in the wilderness, the greater the risk of discovery or disaster. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel added, "We're almost out of provisions. I'll need to hunt tomorrow, find something to sustain us." Rebecca reached for her journal, now mostly dry thanks to its position deep within her pack. She wrote quickly, "What if Silverdale isn't safe? The Colonel may have men there too." It was a fear that had grown within her as they traveled. Silverdale was larger than Thornfield Junction, but not so large that strangers wouldn't be noticed. If Colonel Hargrove had spread his net wide enough, they might be riding directly into a trap. Daniel considered her words. "We'll approach carefully, scout the town before entering. The newspaper office should be easy to find without exposing ourselves unnecessarily." Rebecca wasn't entirely convinced, but they had few alternatives. She wrote again. "And Senator Gardner? How do we reach him in Denver?" "One step at a time," Daniel replied. "The newspaper editor first. If he's the man you believe him to be, he'll have connections, ways to get messages to Denver safely." It was a reasonable plan, but Rebecca had lived long enough to know that reasonable plans often crumbled when confronted with reality. She stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker against the gathering darkness. 4 seasons of silence had taught her patience, but also caution. Nothing was certain except the danger that pursued them. As the night deepened around their small fire, Rebecca found herself studying Daniel's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the watchful eyes that missed nothing, the quiet dignity with which he faced each challenge. In the short time they had traveled together, he had proven himself brave, resourceful, and unfailingly honorable. A man worthy of trust, if such a thing still existed in her world. She tapped his arm to get his attention, then wrote in her journal, "Why risk your life for a stranger's cause?" Daniel read her question, then looked back at the fire. For a long moment he didn't respond, and Rebecca wondered if she had overstepped. "When I was at the mission school," he finally said, voice low, "there was a Cherokee boy named Joseph, younger than me, maybe 8 years old. He spoke no English when they brought him in. The missionaries beat him whenever he used Cherokee words. His expression hardened at the memory. One night, I found him trying to escape. Instead of stopping him, I helped him, got him food, a blanket, pointed him toward home. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. The missionaries discovered his absence at morning roll call, blamed me immediately. I had a reputation for defiance. Their punishment was severe." Rebecca could see the echo of old pain in his eyes, though his voice remained steady. 3 days later, they brought Joseph back. He'd been caught by army scouts 15 miles from the school. That night I heard him crying in the dormitory, not because he'd been recaptured, but because he felt he'd failed me, because my suffering had been for nothing. Daniel turned to meet Rebecca's gaze. "I told him then that no act of defiance against injustice is ever wasted, that every time we stand against cruelty, even when we lose, we deny it complete victory." He gestured toward the strongbox, barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight. "Your fight against these men, it matters, not just for the dead at Copper Creek, but for all who suffer under corrupted power. I help you because your cause is just, because silence in the face of evil is its own kind of surrender." Rebecca felt something shift within her, a loosening of the hard shell she had built around her heart since the massacre. This man understood what drove her, what had kept her alive through 4 seasons of isolation and grief. Not just survival, but the stubborn, unyielding belief that truth mattered, that justice, however delayed, was worth any price. On impulse, she reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture but profound in its meaning. For 4 seasons, she had avoided human touch, had flinched from even the most casual contact. Now she initiated it, acknowledging the connection between them that transcended words. Daniel's hand closed gently around hers, warm and calloused. Neither spoke. She couldn't. He didn't need to. Some understandings required no voice. They sat that way as the fire burned low, 2 wounded souls, finding unexpected strength in shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new decisions. But for this moment, beneath a canopy of stars indifferent to human struggles, they were not alone. And that, Rebecca realized, made all the difference. The night grew colder as the fire diminished to embers. Daniel eventually rose to add more wood, his movements careful to avoid disturbing the peaceful silence that had settled between them. Rebecca wrapped herself in a blanket now mostly dry from the fire's heat, her body exhausted, but her mind strangely alert. For the first time in 4 seasons, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. If they succeeded, if they reached Silverdale, if the newspaper editor proved trustworthy, if Senator Gardner received the documents and acted upon them, what then? She had lived so long in the shadow of the past that the possibility of stepping into light seemed almost foreign, frightening in its unfamiliarity. Would she speak again? The question arose unbidden. Her silence had begun as shock, transformed into protection, and eventually become habit. She wasn't certain she remembered how to form words aloud, whether her voice would even function after so long unused. Yet the thought no longer seemed impossible. Perhaps, when justice was served, when the dead of Copper Creek were finally avenged, words would return. Perhaps. Daniel settled beside her again, arranging his own blanket. "We should sleep in shifts," he said quietly. "I'll take first watch." Rebecca nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily despite her physical exhaustion. Too many thoughts crowded her mind, too many possibilities and dangers loomed on tomorrow's horizon. She was wrong. Within moments of lying down, her body surrendered to exhaustion, pulling her into deep, dreamless rest. When Daniel woke her for her watch, the moon had risen high, bathing their shelter in silver light. Rebecca sat wrapped in her blanket, back against the rock wall, eyes scanning the darkness beyond their camp. The strongbox rested beside her, its weight both physical and symbolic. Within it lay not just gold and documents, but the possibility of redemption, for the dead, for herself, perhaps even for a nation still wounded from war and corruption. As she maintained her vigil through the quiet hours of night, Rebecca found herself remembering James, not his death, but his life, his quiet determination when he discovered the corruption within the War Department, his refusal to look away from uncomfortable truths. "Some burdens choose us," he had told her when explaining why they needed to leave their comfortable life in Washington. "We don't get to decide which injustices cross our path, only how we respond to them." He would approve of what she was doing. Now, she thought, would understand the risks she took, the alliance she had formed with Daniel. James had never been a man to value safety over principle. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when something caught her attention. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, gone almost before she registered it. Rebecca froze, straining her eyes to penetrate the pre-dawn shadows. Nothing moved, yet the sense of being watched crawled across her skin like ice. Slowly, carefully, she reached over and touched Daniel's shoulder. He woke instantly, eyes alert. her body tensing at her expression of alarm. She pointed toward the eastern slope where she had seen the movement. Daniel rose silently, hand moving to the knife at his belt. He crept to the edge of their shelter, blending into the shadows with practiced ease. Rebecca held her breath, fingers closing around a heavy branch they had collected for firewood, a poor weapon, but better than nothing. Long minutes passed. Intense silence. The sky continued to lighten, pink and gold replacing the deep blue of night. Birds began their morning chorus, a counterpoint to Rebecca's pounding heart. Then Daniel was back, his expression not fearful, but puzzled. "Deer," he whispered. A small herd passed below, but something spooked them. They were running from something. Or someone. The unspoken possibility hung between them. Rebecca glanced at their meager camp, the remnants of their fire, Jasper dozing nearby, their few possessions scattered around the shelter. Evidence of human presence, visible to knowledgeable eyes. Daniel seemed to follow her thoughts. "We should move on, now." There was no argument from Rebecca. Whether the deer had been startled by natural predators or human hunters, lingering presented unnecessary risk. They packed swiftly, erasing signs of their camp as best they could. Daniel scattered the ashes of their fire, covered indentations in the soft earth where they had slept. The sun was just cresting the eastern mountains when they set out, following game trails that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Daniel led the way on foot, Jasper following with Rebecca on his back. The horse seemed to sense their urgency, moving with purpose despite the difficult path. By mid-morning, they had climbed higher into the foothills. The valley below spread out like a patchwork quilt of forests and meadows. Daniel paused occasionally to study their back trail, eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. Each time he moved on without comment, but his increasing vigilance told Rebecca all she needed to know. Someone was following them. They stopped briefly at noon to rest Jasper and share the last of their provisions, a handful of dried beef and 2 nearly stale biscuits. As they ate, Daniel pointed to a distant ridge where the land fell away sharply. "Miller's Ridge," he said. "Beyond it lies the eastern approach to Silverdale. If we push hard, we can reach it by nightfall, be in town by tomorrow morning." Rebecca studied the terrain between their position and the ridge. Mostly forested, with occasional clearings and what appeared to be a river cutting through the valley floor. Difficult country to traverse quickly, but also difficult country in which to be tracked. She took out her journal. "Who's following us?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "Not sure. Saw tracks back near the deer crossing. Boot prints, military issue, at least 2 men." He glanced back the way they had come. Moving fast. Rebecca felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Colonel Hargrove's men had managed to pick up their trail despite the rain, despite their precautions. The pursuit was closing in. How did they find us? Daniel shook his head. Could be luck, could be skill, could be... He hesitated. What? Could be they're not tracking us at all, but heading to the same place we are, Silverdale. The possibility hadn't occurred to Rebecca, but it made sense. If the colonel suspected their destination, he might have sent men ahead to intercept, rather than simply chase them through wilderness. A sobering thought. Then Silverdale may already be watched. Yes, Daniel acknowledged, but we still need to try. The strongbox is useless to us out here. He was right, of course. They could hide in the wilderness for days, weeks even, but eventually supplies, weather, or pursuit would force them into civilization. Their only hope lay in reaching allies, who could help protect them and leverage the evidence they carried. They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, pushing harder despite Rebecca's pain and Jasper's increasing fatigue. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached Miller's Ridge. Steep inclines, loose shale that shifted treacherously. Underfoot, thick underbrush that snagged clothing and equipment. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered again, promising more rain. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of moisture and the distant rumble of thunder. Daniel studied the sky with concern. "Storm coming," he said. "A bad one from the look of it." Rebecca nodded. She could feel the change in the air, the heaviness that preceded violent weather. Her leg ached fiercely, old injuries always more painful before storms. Yet she didn't signal for rest. The worse the weather, the better their chances of losing their pursuers. They reached the base of Miller's Ridge as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The climb ahead looked daunting, nearly vertical in places, with few clear trails visible. Jasper snorted nervously, sensing the difficulty to come. Daniel surveyed the ridge face, then turned to Rebecca. "We can't take the horse up this, too dangerous in the rain." Rebecca understood the implications immediately. Without Jasper, their pace would slow dramatically. Her injured leg would make climbing nearly impossible, yet there seemed no alternative. Before she could respond, a sound cut through the gathering storm. The crack of a rifle, followed by the whine of a bullet passing overhead. Daniel reacted instantly, pulling Rebecca from the saddle and behind an outcropping of rock. "Stay down!" Another shot rang out, striking a stone near their position, sending fragments flying. Rebecca pressed herself against the rock, heart hammering in her chest. After 4 seasons of running, after all their efforts to evade pursuit, it seemed the past had finally caught up to them. Daniel peered carefully around the edge of their shelter, then ducked back as another bullet struck nearby. "2 men," he reported grimly. "On the slope below, military rifles." Rebecca didn't need to write her question. It was evident in her eyes. "No way past them on foot," Daniel confirmed. "Not with your leg. And they've got the high ground, better weapons." They were trapped between the gunmen below and the impossible ridge above. The strongbox, their evidence, their chance for justice, all suddenly at risk. Rebecca's mind raced, searching for options. They could surrender, but that meant certain death once Colonel Hargrove had the strongbox in his possession. They could try to outrun the gunman, but with her injury and the difficult terrain, capture was inevitable. That left only one choice: fight. She reached for Daniel's arm, her expression resolute. When he met her gaze, she pointed to herself. Then, to their left where the ridge curved, offering potential cover. Then she pointed to him, then to the right, a flanking maneuver. Daniel shook his head. "Too dangerous. They'll pick you off the moment you move." Rebecca's jaw set stubbornly. She would not be the weak link, would not be the reason they failed. She wrote quickly in her journal, "I'll draw their fire. You circle behind. It's our only chance." Rebecca. Daniel started to protest, but another shot cut him off, this one closer than before. The gunmen were advancing. Time had run out. Rebecca grasped the front of Daniel's shirt, pulling him close enough to see the determination burning in her eyes. This wasn't a request, it was a decision. After a moment, Daniel nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," he said, voice tight. "Stay low, move only when they're reloading." Rebecca squeezed his arm in acknowledgement, then prepared herself for what might be her final act of defiance. The strongbox lay between them, its contents worth dying for, but she hoped worth living for as well. As the storm fully engulfed the ridge in sheets of driving rain, Rebecca Marshall took a deep breath and made her choice. The rain fell in, blinding sheets, transforming Miller's Ridge into a treacherous cascade of mud and loose stone. Rebecca crouched behind the rock outcropping, counting silently in her head. 1, 2, 3. On 4, she flung herself to the left, diving toward a fallen log as bullets splintered bark near her head. The sudden movement sent pain lancing through her injured knee, but adrenaline pushed it to the periphery of her awareness. She scrambled behind the log, pressing her body into the sodden earth as more shots rang out. Through the curtain of rain, she caught glimpses of the men pursuing them. 2 figures in dark coats moving methodically up the slope, rifles raised. Professionals, not local lawmen. Colonel Hargrove's personal hunters. While their attention focused on her position, Daniel slipped away to the right, using the storm and underbrush as cover. Rebecca could no longer see him, could only hope he was executing their desperate plan. Drawing a deep breath, she raised her head just enough to be seen, then ducked back as another bullet struck the log. The gunmen were conserving ammunition, firing single, carefully aimed shots rather than wasting bullets. Rebecca counted the seconds between volleys, establishing their rhythm. When the next shot came, she lifted the branch she had carried from their camp and pushed her shawl into view on its end. The reaction was immediate. 2 shots in quick succession, shredding the fabric. In that moment of distraction, Rebecca rolled from behind the log to a cluster of boulders several yards away. Pain exploded in her knee, nearly causing her to cry out. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, forcing back the sound. From her new position, Rebecca could see that her diversion was working. The gunmen had split up, one continuing toward her previous hiding place while the other moved to cut off her apparent escape route. Neither seemed aware of Daniel's flanking movement. She needed to keep them focused on her, to buy Daniel more time. Looking around desperately, she spotted a loose rock about the size of her fist. She grabbed it, waited for the next lull in gunfire, then hurled it toward a thicket of bushes away. From both Daniel's position and her own, the stone crashed through branches, creating enough noise to draw the attention of both gunmen. One fired immediately toward the sound. The other, more cautious, held his position, scanning the ridge face methodically. The storm intensified, lightning splitting the sky above Miller's Ridge, thunder rolling across the valley floor. The deluge reduced visibility to mere yards. Mixed blessing that both concealed Rebecca's movements and made it nearly impossible to track Daniel's progress. She needed to move again to maintain the illusion of a desperate flight up the ridge. Her next potential shelter, a stand of pines growing improbably from a fissure in the rock face, lay nearly 15 yards away, an eternity of open ground. Rebecca gathered herself, muscles tensing. She would have one chance, one desperate sprint before the gunman realized her strategy. As another lightning bolt illuminated the ridge in stark relief, she launched herself toward the trees. The motion caught the eye of the more cautious gunman. He pivoted, rifle rising to his shoulder. Rebecca saw the movement too late to change course. In the split second before he fired, her mind filled with a single stark regret. Not that she would die, but that she would die silent, her story untold, justice undelivered. The shot never came. Instead, a dark figure materialized from the storm behind the gunman. Daniel moved with lethal efficiency, one hand clamping over the man's mouth while the other drove his knife upward. The rifle clattered to the ground as the man's body went limp. The second gunman turned at the sound, but Rebecca had reached the pines. She snatched up a fallen branch and stepped back into the open, hurling it toward him with all her strength. The branch caught him across the face, momentarily stunning him. Enough distraction for Daniel to close the distance and tackle him to the ground. The ensuing struggle was brief but violent. Though caught by surprise, the gunman was well trained, landing several solid blows before Daniel pinned him, knife pressed to his throat. "Who sent you?" Daniel demanded, voice barely audible above the storm. The man's eyes darted between Daniel and Rebecca, who had limped forward to retrieve the fallen rifle. A cold smile twisted his lips. "Doesn't matter. You're already dead. Both of you." "Colonel Hargrove," Daniel pressed. "Where is he?" "Waiting in Silverdale." The gunman's smile widened. "With 20 men. There's no way out." Rebecca felt ice form in her veins. Their destination was indeed a trap. But something in the man's tone, a hint of satisfaction beyond mere threat, suggested more. Daniel heard it too. "What else?" he demanded, pressing the knife harder. The gunman laughed, a harsh sound like stones grinding together. "The senator. You plan to contact Gardner? He's Hargrove's brother-in-law. Been protecting him for years." his eyes fixed on Rebecca. "Your husband never knew who he was really working for." The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Senator Montgomery Gardner, her father's friend, James's mentor, the man they had trusted above all others, was complicit in the corruption. In the massacre, in everything, their last hope of official justice evaporated like morning mist. Daniel's expression hardened. "You're lying. Why would I?" Blood trickled from the gunman's scalp, where the branch had struck him, mixing with rain. On his face, "You won't make it to sunrise. Colonel's orders were clear. No survivors this time either." Rebecca stepped forward, the rifle steady in her hands. She met the gunman's eyes, saw the moment he recognized her, not just as a target, but as the woman who had survived Copper Creek, the woman who had witnessed everything. "Go ahead," he taunted. "Pull the trigger, won't change anything. The colonel has the town locked down. The newspaper office is being watched. You've got nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." His gaze shifted to the strongbox still strapped to Jasper's saddle. "And nowhere to take your evidence." Daniel looked to Rebecca, a silent question in his eyes. They couldn't release this man. He would report their position immediately. But killing an unarmed prisoner went against everything Daniel believed. Rebecca made the decision for them both. She reversed the rifle, bringing the butt down hard against the gunman's temple. He collapsed, unconscious but alive. "He'll wake up eventually," Daniel said, rising and wiping his knife on his trousers. "We need to move." Rebecca nodded, her mind racing to process the devastating news. Their careful plan, already dangerous, now seemed impossible. Silverdale was no sanctuary, the newspaper no ally, Senator Gardner no champion of justice. They were alone, with evidence no one would see and truth no one would hear. She retrieved her journal from inside her coat, protected from the rain by an oilcloth wrapper. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote. "What now?" Daniel read her words, rain dripping from his hair as he considered their options. "We can't go back, can't go forward to Silverdale." He looked up at the ridge looming above them. "Over the top. There's a valley beyond, small settlements, farms, places too insignificant for the colonel to watch." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. Rebecca gestured to the unconscious gunman. "We'll tie them," Daniel decided. "It'll slow them down once they wake." They worked quickly, using the men's own belts and bandanas to secure them. To separate trees, Daniel collected their weapons, 2 rifles and a pistol, welcome additions to their meager arsenal. Rebecca gathered the strongbox and what remained of their supplies. The storm continued unabated as they began the arduous climb up Miller's Ridge, now even more treacherous with water cascading down its face. Jasper struggled on the steep incline, forcing them to lead him carefully from handhold to handhold. Rebecca's injured knee threatened to buckle with each step, but she pushed forward, driven by a determination that transcended physical pain. If Silverdale was close to them, if Senator Gardner was an enemy rather than an ally, they would find another way. The truth would not die on this mountainside, not after everything it had cost to preserve it. They reached the ridgetop as darkness fell completely, the storm finally beginning to abate. Below them stretched a valley unlike the one they had left. Narrower, more winding, with scattered lights indicating homesteads and small settlements. Somewhere in that darkness lay their future, uncertain as it was. "We'll make camp here," Daniel decided, finding a small hollow protected by wind-twisted pines. "Continue at first light." Rebecca nodded, too exhausted to do more than sink to the ground, her leg finally giving out completely. Daniel tended to Jasper, then managed to start a small fire despite the lingering dampness. The warmth was minimal but welcome as they huddled close, their wet clothes steaming slightly in the heat. "We need a new plan," Daniel said after they had eaten the last of their provisions, a handful of jerky salvaged from their packs. "The newspaper is still our best option, but we'll need to find a way past the colonel's men." Rebecca took out her journal, writing by the flickering firelight. What about Thomas Wolfe Path? Could he help? Daniel considered this. He would try. But my village is 3 days' ride west, and the colonel's men are already searching for a Cherokee traveling with a white woman. We'd bring danger to my people. Rebecca understood. After what she had learned today about Senator Gardner's betrayal, she was reluctant to involve anyone else in their desperate situation. Too many had already died because of the secrets contained in the strongbox. We could split up, she suggested. You take the evidence to the newspaper. I'll create a diversion. Daniel's expression grew troubled. They're hunting both of us now. And you're injured. He gestured to her swollen knee. Besides, I won't leave you to face them alone. Rebecca's pencil moved across the paper, frustration evident in her tight script. We can't just wander the wilderness forever. The documents need to reach someone who can use them. Agreed, but not at the cost of your life. Daniel stirred the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the night. There must be someone else, someone beyond the colonel's influence. Rebecca stared into the flames, mentally reviewing every contact, every potential ally she had known before Copper Creek. Most were too distant, too difficult to reach in their current circumstances. Some, like Senator Gardner, might be compromised as well. After 4 seasons of isolation, her world had contracted to the point where trustworthy connections were few. Then a memory surfaced. A conversation around a campfire on the wagon train, weeks before the massacre. James, animated by caffeine and purpose, telling her about a journalist he had corresponded with, a man known for exposing corruption during the war, regardless of which side benefited. A man whose integrity had cost him his position at several prestigious newspapers, forcing him to establish his own small printing operation. Rebecca wrote quickly, excitement building as the plan took shape in her mind. Nathan Winters, independent, journalist, office in Promise Creek north of here. James trusted him. Daniel read her words, cautious hope kindling in his eyes. How far? Rebecca sketched a rough map on a blank page, marking their current position on Miller's Ridge and the approximate location of Promise Creek. The distance was considerable but not impossible. Perhaps 2 days' hard travel through the valley below. It could work, Daniel acknowledged. Small enough town that the colonel might not have men there yet. Far enough from Silverdale to give us time. He studied the map again. But there's risk. If this Winters can't be trusted, or if the colonel's influence reaches further than we know. Rebecca reclaimed the journal, her writing firm and decisive. Every choice now is risk. I choose this one. Daniel met her gaze, then nodded slowly. Promise Creek, then. We'll start at dawn. They settled in for the night, taking turns keeping watch. Rebecca's mind was too active for true rest, continually analyzing their situation, searching for overlooked dangers or opportunities. The revelation about Senator Gardner had shaken her deeply. If James's mentor was corrupt, how many others? Might be. How far did the conspiracy reach? Dawn arrived with clear skies and a biting chill that penetrated their still damp clothing. They broke camp quickly, erasing signs of their presence before beginning the descent into the valley. Rebecca's knee had stiffened overnight, forcing her to rely heavily on the walking stick Daniel had fashioned, and occasionally on Jasper when the terrain allowed. The valley proved easier to navigate than the ridge. Gentler slopes, established game trails, streams running clear after the storm. They avoided the scattered homesteads visible in the distance, keeping to forested areas whenever possible. Though the immediate threat had been left behind on the other side of the ridge, caution had become second nature. By midday, hunger had become a pressing concern. Their supplies were exhausted, and neither had eaten properly in days. Daniel finally called a halt near a small stream, securing Jasper before disappearing into the underbrush with one of the captured rifles. Rebecca used the opportunity to rest her leg and refill their canteens with fresh water. He returned an hour later with 2 rabbits and a handful of wild onions. "Not much," he acknowledged, "but it will keep us moving." They cooked the game over, a small fire, sharing the meager meal in companionable silence. As they prepared to continue their journey, Rebecca found herself studying Daniel's face. The lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination despite exhaustion. In the short time they had traveled together, he had become more than an ally, a friend, perhaps something more in a future she barely dared imagine. The afternoon brought them deeper into the valley, where the scattered settlements gave way to more continuous farmland. Avoiding detection became increasingly difficult as they were forced to skirt fields and orchards. Twice they froze in cover as wagons passed on nearby roads, hearts pounding as they waited to see if the travelers had spotted them. As evening approached, they found themselves at the edge of a small apple orchard. The trees, heavy with ripening fruit, offered both food and concealment. Daniel helped Rebecca settle beneath the spreading branches of a particularly large tree, then foraged enough apples to supplement their diet of rabbit and wild onions. "We've made good progress," he said as they ate. "Another full day's travel should bring us within sight of Promise Creek, if your map is accurate." Rebecca nodded, relief mingling with trepidation. They were getting closer to their goal, but also running out of wilderness in which to hide. Soon they would need to approach civilization with all its attendant risks. Taking out her journal, she wrote a question that had been forming in her mind throughout the day. If we succeed, if Winters publishes the documents, what will you do? Daniel seemed surprised by the question, as if he hadn't considered a future beyond their immediate objective. Return to my people, I suppose. Help Thomas protect them from whatever changes come. He studied her face. And you? It was Rebecca's turn to be caught off guard. For 4 seasons, survival had been her only goal. The possibility of life after justice remained undefined, a blank page she had been afraid to contemplate. "I don't know," she wrote honestly. "My old life is gone. I'm not sure who I am without this fight." Daniel's expression softened. "You're the woman who survived when others didn't, who kept truth alive when it would have been easier to let it die." He reached across the space between them, gently touching her hand. "Whatever you choose to become next, that courage remains." Rebecca felt tears threatening, not the overwhelming grief that had assaulted her at Copper Creek, but something gentler, more healing. The acknowledgement of pain endured and strength discovered, the possibility of transformation rather than mere survival. Before she could respond, Jasper's ears pricked forward, his body tensing. Daniel was on his feet instantly, rifle ready, scanning their surroundings. Rebecca listened intently, her senses sharpened by days of danger. At first, she heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of approaching evening. Birds settling, a distant creak, the whisper of wind through leaves. Then came the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats on the road beyond the orchard. Not a single rider or wagon, but multiple horses moving at a steady pace. Too many for coincidence. Daniel signaled for silence, then motioned for her to stay put while he crept forward to investigate. Rebecca watched as he disappeared among the trees, her heart hammering against her ribs. Long minutes passed before he returned, his expression grim. "Military patrol," he reported, keeping his voice low. 6 men, well armed, moving north, toward Promise Creek, the same direction they needed to travel. Rebecca's stomach clenched with dread. If Colonel Hargrove had already dispatched men to Promise Creek, their last hope of finding an ally might be extinguished before they even arrived. She wrote quickly in her journal. Could they be regular army, not the Colonel's men? Daniel shook his head. No markings, no uniforms, same type as the men who attacked us on the ridge. The colonel isn't taking chances. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, frustration washing through her. Every path forward seemed blocked, every potential ally, compromised or under surveillance. After everything they had endured, to falter so close to their goal seemed unbearably cruel. Daniel studied her face, then made a decision. We'll follow them. Rebecca's eyes snapped open, questioning evident in her expression. Not to engage, Daniel clarified. To observe. If they're setting up a watch at Promise Creek, we need to know before we walk into it. Knowledge is our only advantage now. It was a risky strategy, but Rebecca couldn't fault the logic. They needed information, more than ever. She nodded her agreement, already calculating what supplies they would need for the final push toward Promise Creek. The strongbox would remain with them, too valuable to cache, too important to abandon. They spent the night at the edge of the orchard, sleeping in brief shifts, alert for any sign of danger. Dawn found them already moving, following the road north at a discreet distance. The patrol had left clear tracks, making them easy to trail without exposing themselves. The valley narrowed as they traveled, hemmed in by increasingly steep hillsides. Farms gave way to scattered mining operations, small claims with rough, wooden sluices diverting stream water, the occasional deeper shaft marked by crude windlasses. The Promise Creek area had seen a minor gold rush some years earlier, Rebecca recalled. Not rich enough to attract major operations, but sufficient to support determined individuals. By midday, they caught sight of the patrol again. The 6 riders had stopped at a crossroads, apparently discussing their route. Daniel and Rebecca watched from the cover of a stand of aspens as one rider pointed north, another west. After a brief conference, they split into 2 groups, 4 continuing north toward Promise Creek, 2 heading west along a less-traveled trail. They're covering all approaches, Daniel observed quietly. The colonel is thorough, I'll give him that. Rebecca frowned, writing in her journal. He knows we're coming this way. How? Daniel had no answer, but the implication was troubling. Either Colonel Hargrove had predicted their movements with uncanny accuracy, or someone had informed him of their destination. Either possibility suggested they were more vulnerable than they had realized. They followed the larger group of riders, maintaining a careful distance. As the afternoon waned, the first buildings of Promise Creek became visible in the distance, a small settlement nestled alongside the stream that gave it its name. From their vantage point on a wooded hillside, they could see the main street with its assortment of wooden structures, a church steeple rising above the surrounding rooftops, smoke curling from chimneys as the evening meal was prepared. And watching it all, positioned at strategic points around the town's perimeter, were the colonel's men. They've surrounded it, Daniel said, lowering the spyglass he had taken from one of the gunmen on the ridge. 2 at the northern approach, 2 to the south, the 2 who split off probably covering the western trail, and likely more inside the town itself. Rebecca took the spyglass, confirming his assessment. Promise Creek was sealed tight, every obvious approach watched by men whose sole purpose was to prevent them from reaching Nathan Winters. She returned the spyglass to Daniel, then wrote in her journal, "We need a diversion, something to draw them away from their posts." Daniel considered this, eyes scanning the landscape. "The mining operations," he said finally. "If we could create a disturbance at one of the larger claims, a fire perhaps or an explosion." Rebecca shook her head. "Too many innocent people might be hurt." She wrote again, "What about the stream itself? It feeds the town. If we redirected it upstream." Daniel's eyes lit with understanding. "Flash flood. The miners have dams for their operations. If we breached one suddenly—" He nodded slowly. "It would draw attention, force them to respond, create a gap in their perimeter." It was a plan born of desperation, but with potential. The mining dams they had passed were substantial enough to hold significant water, but built quickly and with minimal engineering. One strategic weakness, exploited at the right moment, could send a surge of water toward the town. Not enough to cause serious damage, but sufficient to create alarm and confusion. As night fell, they made their way back upstream, moving carefully to avoid the patrols. The largest dam they had seen lay approximately a mile from town, where the stream narrowed between rocky banks. By starlight, they assessed its construction. Logs and stone, reinforced with packed earth, creating a pool that fed a series of sluices for separating gold from sediment. Here, Daniel indicated a section where the water already seeped through, in small rivulets. If we weaken this area, the force of the backed-up water will do the rest. They worked silently, Daniel using his knife to enlarge the existing gaps, while Rebecca gathered rocks to place downstream, directing the flow toward the town rather than allowing it to dissipate across the wider streambed. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by darkness and the need for stealth. Near midnight, Daniel stepped back, surveying their efforts. "One more breach should do it," he said quietly. "But once it starts, we'll need to move fast. The patrol will respond, but they'll also alert the others to watch for us." Rebecca nodded her understanding. This would give them one chance, a brief window to enter Promise Creek and find Nathan Winters before the colonel's men regrouped. She wrote a final question in her journal. "How will we know Winters? Where to find him?" Daniel frowned. "A printing press is distinctive. Noisy, requires space, likely on the main street for visibility." He glanced toward the distant town, now dark except for a few scattered lights. "We'll find it. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had." Rebecca tucked her journal away, then helped Daniel position himself at the weakest point of the dam. On his signal, she would trigger their diversion while he made his way downstream. To meet her at the edge of town, with the strongbox secured to her back, Rebecca waited as Daniel gave one final strike to the dam's weakest point. Water began to seep through more quickly, the structure groaning as pressure increased against the compromised section. Daniel stepped back, nodding to Rebecca. It was time. She brought a large rock down hard on the damaged area, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th impact, the dam gave way with a sound like tearing canvas. Water surged through the breach, carrying debris and gathering force as it raced downstream toward Promise Creek. Daniel disappeared into the darkness, heading for their rendezvous point. Rebecca followed more slowly, her injured leg protesting the uneven terrain. Behind her, the sound of rushing water grew, not a devastating flood, but enough to cause alarm in the sleeping town. She reached the edge of Promise Creek, just as shouts of warning rose from the settlement. Lanterns flared. To life, figures rushing to secure property against the unexpected surge of water. As predicted, the colonel's men stationed at the northern perimeter abandoned their posts, drawn by the commotion and perhaps concerned for their comrades in town. Daniel materialized from the shadows, taking her arm to help her navigate the final. "Approach, now," he urged, while they're distracted. They slipped into Promise Creek through the temporary gap in surveillance, keeping to shadows as they made their way down the main street. The town was in controlled chaos, residents forming bucket brigades to protect the more vulnerable structures, miners from nearby claims offering assistance, children being ushered to higher ground. No one paid attention to 2 more figures moving purposefully through the confusion. "There!" Daniel pointed to a building set slightly back from the others. A wooden sign hung above the door, the words, "Promise Creek Independent Press," barely visible in the erratic light of the emergency lanterns. The building was dark, apparently empty. Rebecca's heart sank. Had Nathan Winters fled? Or worse, had the colonel's men already found him? Daniel tried the door. Locked. Without hesitation, he moved to a side window, using his knife to pry it open. Rebecca glanced around anxiously, but the townspeople remained focused on the minor flood threatening their homes and businesses. No one noticed as Daniel helped her. Through the window, then followed. Inside, the building was cluttered but orderly. A large printing press dominated the main room, surrounded by cases of type, stacks of paper, and barrels of ink. A small desk near the front window held an oil lamp unlit and scattered notes. At the back, a curtain separated the work area from what appeared to be living quarters. "Hello?" Daniel called softly. "Mr. Winters?" No response. Rebecca moved cautiously through the room, examining the press and the most recent edition of the Promise Creek Sentinel still set in the frame. The date showed it had been printed just 2 days earlier. The press was active, not abandoned. A floorboard creaked behind the curtain. Daniel's hand moved to his knife as the fabric parted to reveal a man holding a shotgun aimed directly at them. "Give me one reason not to pull this trigger," he said, voice steady despite being outnumbered. He was older than Rebecca had expected, perhaps 60, with a shock of white hair and a beard to match. His clothes were rumpled, as if he had been sleeping in them, but his eyes were sharp and alertly assessing his unexpected visitors. Daniel slowly raised his hands. "Are you Nathan Winters?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Depends who's asking." "Friends." "Of James Marshall," Daniel replied. "We have something he wanted you to see." The name caused a visible reaction, surprise, then grief, then caution in quick succession. "James Marshall is dead, killed in an Indian attack 4 years ago." Rebecca stepped forward, lowering her hood so the man could see her face clearly in the dim light filtering through the windows. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "My God," he whispered, "you're his wife. The report said everyone died in that massacre." Rebecca nodded, then gestured for her journal. Daniel handed it to her, keeping his movements slow and deliberate with the shotgun still trained on them. She wrote quickly, then held the page for Winters to read. It wasn't Indians, it was government men. "We have proof." Winters lowered the shotgun slightly, intrigue warring with caution on his weathered face. "What kind of proof?" In answer, Rebecca unslung the strongbox from her back and placed it on a nearby table. The key, still on its cord around her neck, glinted in the faint light. "We've been running for days," Daniel explained. "Colonel Hargrove's men are searching for us, for that box. They've surrounded your town." Hargrove. Winters spat the name like something foul. "That explains the military types asking questions. Yesterday, said they were looking for army deserters." He set the shotgun aside and moved closer to examine the strongbox. "What's in it?" Rebecca opened the box, revealing the documents and gold within. Winters lifted the leather portfolio, quickly, scanning the first few pages. His expression hardened with each document he reviewed. "These directly link Secretary Wilson to war profiteering," he murmured. "Weapons sales to both sides during the conflict. Misappropriation of military funds." He looked up at Rebecca. "Your husband discovered this?" She nodded, writing again. "He was a War Department clerk, found discrepancies in the accounts, started keeping records. When they discovered what he knew, they arranged the massacre to silence him and recover the evidence." Winters' face paled. "And you've carried this knowledge for 4 years, alone?" Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she wrote again. "Not always alone. Thomas Wolfe Path found me after the massacre. Daniel helped me recover the strongbox." Winters glanced at Daniel, noting his Cherokee features. Something like respect flickered in the older man's eyes. "Brave man, helping a white woman against government men. They'd hang you without a trial if they caught you." Daniel shrugged. "Justice doesn't belong to one people. Neither does corruption." Winters returned to the documents, examining them with a journalist's trained eye. These are genuine, he concluded. Government letterhead, official seals, Wilson's signature. He tapped one particular document. This one directly orders the transfer of the gold shipment to California, authorizing necessary measures to ensure security. His mouth twisted in disgust. Bureaucratic language for murder. He looked up at them. Decision. I'll print it. Every word. Send copies to every newspaper within 500 miles. A grim smile touched his lips. They can't suppress it if it's everywhere at once. Relief washed through Rebecca, so powerful she nearly swayed on her feet. After 4 seasons of silence, of carrying this burden alone, someone would finally hear the truth. The dead of Copper Creek would have their justice, but Winters wasn't finished. Getting this published is only the first step. You'll need protection until the story spreads widely enough that killing you becomes pointless. He considered for a moment. I have a friend, federal marshal based in Denver, incorruptible as they come. Once the story breaks, he can arrange official protection for your testimony. Rebecca exchanged glances with Daniel. After the revelation about Senator Gardner, trust came difficult. She wrote her concern in the journal. How do we know he's not working with the colonel too? Winter's expression softened with understanding. You don't, but Marshal Blackwood lost his son at Shiloh. The idea that government officials profited from the war that killed his boy? He shook his head. He'd burn the world to expose them. It was a risk, but one they had no choice but to take. Every hour they remained in Promise Creek increased the danger of discovery. Once Winters published the documents, the colonel would know exactly where to find them. How soon can you print this? Daniel asked. By morning, Winters replied. I'll wake my assistant. Start setting the type immediately. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain at the street outside. The flood's being contained. Your diversion worked, but it won't keep them distracted much longer. He turned back to them, expression grave. You can't stay here. The press is the first place they'll look once they realize you've reached town. There's a root cellar behind the chandler's shop, 3 buildings down. Simon owes me a favor. He'll hide you until the papers are printed, and I can arrange transport to Denver. Rebecca hesitated, reluctant to part with the evidence after carrying it so far, risking so much. Winters seemed to understand her concern. I'll need the documents to print them, he said gently. But the gold stays with you. Insurance that I'll do as promised. Daniel squeezed Rebecca's shoulder reassuringly. It's our best chance. After a moment's consideration, Rebecca nodded agreement. She removed the gold from the strongbox, securing it in her pack, then handed the documents to Winters. The older man accepted them with evident reverence, understanding the sacrifice they represented. Your husband was a brave man, he said quietly. This will expose corruption at the highest levels, change things for the better. Rebecca took her journal again, writing a final request. Tell them what really happened at Copper Creek, that it wasn't an Indian attack, that families died for government greed. Winter's expression grew solemn. I'll make sure the truth is known, every word. As they prepared to leave for the chandler's shop, Rebecca paused, a sudden impulse overtaking her. She turned back to Winters and opened her mouth, forming words that had remained unspoken for 4 seasons. Thank you, she said, voice raspy, and weak from disuse, but unmistakably clear. Winter's eyes widened in surprise, as did Daniel's. Rebecca herself felt a momentary shock at the sound of her own voice. Strange yet familiar, like meeting an old friend after a long separation. Daniel recovered first, a slow smile spreading across his face. He took her hand, squeezing it gently, in understanding. Some burdens, once set down, allowed for new beginnings. They slipped out through the same window they had entered, making their way carefully to the chandler's shop. Simon, the owner, was indeed willing to help, asking no questions as he led them to the hidden root cellar beneath his storehouse. The space was cramped but defensible, with only one entrance and sturdy walls of stone. and earth. As Simon left. Then with blankets, water, and a lantern, Rebecca found herself unexpectedly calm. After days of running, of fighting, of fearing discovery at every moment, the simple act of surrendering their evidence to someone who could use it had lifted an immense weight from her shoulders. Daniel settled beside her in the confined space, his presence steadying. "You spoke," he said quietly, wonder still evident in his tone. Rebecca nodded, touching her throat lightly. The words were there, waiting, rusty from disuse but not gone. Never truly gone. "Does it hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, then whispered, "Feels right." Her voice strengthened slightly with each word, like putting down a stone carried too long. Daniel smiled, genuine warmth reaching his eyes, despite their precarious situation. "The silence protected you," he observed, "and now you've outgrown its protection." Rebecca considered this, finding truth in his assessment. Her silence had been armor, a way to process grief too vast for words, but armor worn too long. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.